Um, um, I'll try and have it fixed, but for now it's still there. So as I was saying, colleagues, it's been a while since we've all been together. We've had a 2-month long constituency period. I really hope that many of us were able to do our constituency work. Often when we are busy with committee work, we don't have enough time to attend to our constituencies. And when we have this dedicated period where we can solely focus on that work, I think it's very important that we take advantage of that opportunity, not only to bring information to our constituencies, but also to take information from them, which we can lift in the various portfolio committees that we serve in. So we do look forward to some of the inputs that members will be giving as we continue with our committee work, that they would have received from their constituencies. I think some of the matters that came from our constituencies were raised during the midterm review for colleagues that could attend. I know some colleagues were inundated with other committee work as we sit in various committees. Not only higher education, I think a number of our colleagues also sit in the basic education committee, which went on oversight last week. Honorable Mananiso also serves on another committee within Parliament that is very busy with important work at this point in time. And so Honorable King was away. She was also away on parliamentary work for her party, but does parliamentary work in Germany. And I hope, Honorable King, you will return with lessons that we can also lessons to share, information to share with our committee and with our department as we continue with this important work that we're doing. So I know already there's a lot that colleagues could share from the constituency period, from places that we've been in to enhance and enrich the work that we are doing. A lot has happened, colleagues, in the last 2 months in our sector. Just at MUT alone, I mean, there have been changes in terms of the leadership there. There was a fire that was of great concern. I know at the University of Pretoria, recently there've been protests, and we did, seek information with regards to that, and that information, or the response to that, was shared with colleagues via email, I believe. There have been deaths at Stellenbosch University. There's also been, progress in relation to the young man who indignified his fellow peer or classmate at Stellenbosch. I think he has been expelled. So there is a lot that has been taking place within the sector. I mean, last week, Friday, we know that the SIU will be investigating NSFAS and maladministration. NSFAS, someone's mic is open. If we can please mute it. Okay, there we go. Welcome, DDG.
Apologies.
And so, so a lot would be important for us to see what we can pick up from what has happened in the last 2 months, and how we can zoom into those matters if they become of relevance and of interest to the committee. Some of that work will have to take place in writing, because our third term is going to be very short, colleagues, and so in fact, I think, and of course, we will share we will share the outcomes of the midterm review. But I think one of the greatest concerns that we have is the limited time that we have for our committee work generally. And I think these are matters that were also raised during the members' training, but also the limited time we have for for ourselves as members of parliament before our term comes to an end, before the sixth administration comes to an end. So we have a lot of work to do. And of course, there've been great discussions around what we prioritize and what our focus areas become. Because just as much as we received a legacy report that recommended areas of focus for us as a sixth administration from the fifth administration, we too will leave umpago for those that will come after us. But it would be important for us to prioritize a few areas for us to focus on and make great strides within. Colleagues, that will also need massive commitment from all of us as members of parliament, as colleagues from the department, from the ministry, from entities, from institutions of higher learning. But it will have to start with us as members of parliament. We will be having more physical meetings as time goes by, either on-site visits, so where we go to an institution. I think we've done visits like that predominantly with DSI. So if the entity or institution is located in Cape Town, we will take advantage of that and want to go. And so we really will need colleagues to avail themselves more. I know the virtual hybrid setup has really been assisting us in killing many birds with one stone, but we have limited time left, colleagues, and we're going to have to become a bit more streamlined and narrow in on our availability for committee work. That's going to be really a great plea from ourselves, that colleagues avail themselves for the work that we've been mandated to do as members of parliament by citizens of this country. So we will require for colleagues to really try their best to avail themselves for physical committee work. So we'll basically be in a hybrid setup where some work is on the virtual platform and some work is physical. Friday, we've had to move colleagues to another date because many colleagues submitted apologies. And I know that many colleagues are interested in the subject matter that was scheduled for Friday. So it would not have been fruitful at all for us to not have, the greater cohort of our members there. And this is ideally not what we would like to do, to move the program around due to that. We do get very frustrated when the executive is not available and we have to move the program around to accommodate them. So I think the same principle of really adhering to the committee program as is needs to be applied to ourselves as well. So we will then be receiving a briefing from the DSI on Friday, which will be on the virtual platform. But soon after that, colleagues, we will have to have that meeting, the working session scheduled in order to raise the many, or clarify, or to allow the entity to clarify the many queries that we have in relation to their operations. Hence, they volunteered this working session, for us to zoom into these matters. And I think these are matters that are of key concern or of great concern to many of us. So I really would appreciate your indulgence in that matter. I think that's it from my side for now, colleagues. We had a really fruitful midterm review and really want to thank all the members that availed themselves for that. I think, more than anything, what has come out of that session is, of course, the great deal of work that we have done, since 2019, but the greater amount of work that we still have to do for the rest of the term. And it was great to interact with many of yourselves in that particular space, and really want to thank you from the departments, from both departments, from the ministry, and our committee staff. Absolutely, such an amazing team to work with, really. Shanaz, Anele, Memudiba, Renee, Agnetha, Tankolo, really thank you so much as well to yourselves. Having said that, colleagues, will now be going into a briefing by the Department of Higher Education and Training. We have received an apology from the minister. He has, Anele, you'll just read that apology for us, please, once I hand over to you. And then we've also received an apology from the Deputy Minister, who is on the platform, but will have to leave us a bit early. I'm not sure if DG's official apology has come through, but oh yes, it did come through, because that is where he indicated that Mr. Mbalo will be the acting DG, who will then lead the delegation from the department this morning, of course, led by the Deputy Minister, Pumalanga. And then, yeah, so those are the apologies I believe we have received this morning. Colleagues, we'll be interacting with a briefing on mergers within the higher education sector. And I think it's something that has been of great concern, particularly coming out of our engagements with WUSU. I think that's really where some of the great concern around that came through. And so we felt it was important for us to prioritize that as part of the third term program. So we look forward to the briefing from the department and members' interaction on that particular briefing. I'd like to, I can't see the DM on the platform unless he's using a device I'm not familiar with. Mr. Pinga, is DM on the platform?
Good morning, Chair. I will quickly check with his office now.
Okay, thank you so much. In the meantime, then, I would like to hand over to Mr. Mbalo, whose device I also can't see, but maybe he's using a different device. There we go. Okay, I see you, Christopher.
I just tried to hide myself a bit, Honorable Chairperson.
Okay. Good morning, DDG Mbalo. Thank you very much for joining us. It is now, wait, sorry, before I hand over to you, DDG Mbalo, Anele, can you just take us through the apology from the Minister, please, before I hand over to DDG Mbalo?
Good morning, Chair. Good morning to the honorable members. Chair, we received an apology from the Minister, who's attending the G20 Education Ministers meeting in Indonesia. So the DG is accompanying the Minister to the G20 Ministers meeting in Indonesia. From the member side, we received an apology from Honorable Chirwa, who's attending the PC on health today. We also received an apology from Honorable Zondo from the IFP, who's not with us today. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Anele. So yes, colleagues, I'll hand over to the department. You've been given an hour, colleagues, to make your presentation on the evaluation of university measures, successes, and challenges. And of course, I think what also becomes really important is how we overcome those particular challenges and work towards strengthening those particular mergers. So yeah, DDG Mbalo, it's 9:20 on the dot, and I'll now be handing over to you, and we'll ask you to conclude by 10:20. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Honorable Chairperson. Very good morning to all members of the Portfolio Committee and the staff of the Portfolio Committee, as well as my esteemed DDGs from the department, obviously in this instance, led by DDG Soqekwa from our university branch, as well as officials within the Office of the Minister, the Office of the Deputy Minister, and the Office of the DG. Whilst the team is flighting the presentation, Honorable Chairperson, I'll just quickly run through with regard to the form of our presentation. Basically, our presentation will be, amongst others, including background and context. In our context, we'll be reflecting in some of the important policy instruments, especially the White Paper 3 on Higher Education Transformation, the National Plan for Higher Education 2001. So we'll reflect on those, as well as then importantly, it will be our policy mandate and rationale. If we look into that, it will be in the main, the barometer upon which we measure and test ourselves with regard to measures and incorporation, especially since early 2000 up until 2004 and so on, because most measures took place in 2004. And then from there, on part 3, we'll be dealing with some of the measures as well as incorporations, but then basically that will be more on infographic information and not on a substantive information. And then after that, it will be post measures, ministerial interventions. Also, that will be a bit of an infographic information. It's like it will be reflecting on the appointment of independent assessors where minister was required to intervene under those circumstances. Much substantive area is going to be on the financial health for the period 2016 to 2020. We're using that period because it's a period, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, whereupon all the information is audited. In the main, they will be looking into various ratios, we'll be looking into surpluses, deficit trends. We have identified 10 merged institutions. We'll be going through each and every institution when we get there. Also, we will be quickly just reflecting on 2 important models, which are informing, of course, measures in our country. And then importantly, also this part will be in the main substantive part, that will be academic enterprise, especially the implications of measures as well as incorporation with regard to academic enterprise of our institution. We'll also zoom into bit detail there, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, in looking into province by province, also reflecting on the P2M implications arising out of measures in each and every institution that will be reflecting onto. And then we'll also be dealing with enrollments. Also, that is going to be a bit of infographic information between 2003 and 2005. You'll see, for example, trends, the ascendance of enrollments in our institutions between those particular periods. And then just close to the end is going to be research outputs at emerged institutions. Also, they will be having a lot of infographic information whereby we reflect so that honorable members can see which institutions are doing pretty well in terms of research outputs, referring obviously to emerged institutions. And then towards the end, then we'll be dealing with the university capacity development program within our institutions. What I will do then, Honorable Chairperson, is to invite DDG Sogqigwa. I know she is with a team of eloquent colleagues who will also be assisting with the presentation. The presentation is not that long, is having about 59 slides. We'll be able to make, of course, within the time accorded to us by the Portfolio Committee. Once again, thanks very much, Honorable Chairperson, honorable members of the Portfolio Committee. I shall then, with your permission, Honorable Chairperson, invite DDG Sogqigwa so that the team can take us through the presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Acting DG Valo. Through you, Chairperson, we have decided to present this as a collective, as a team, given the extensive report. Yes, it is 59 slides. We will try to move through as fast as possible. I just need to start with the context of mergers. So, and then I think it'd be helpful to point to the 4 policy goals of the then second administration, which was 1, to provide increased access to higher education to all, irrespective of race, class, gender, disability, to produce graduates with the skills and competencies necessary to meet the human resource needs of the country. Second, to promote equity of access and to redress past inequalities through ensuring that the staff and student profiles in higher education progressively reflect the demographic realities of South African society. Three, ensure diversity in the organizational form and institutional landscape of the higher education system through program differentiation, thus enabling the addressing of regional and national needs of social and economic development. And fourth, to build a high-level research capacity to address the research and knowledge needs of South Africa. I will be assisted by Dr. Thandi Lewin, Mr. Faisal Tovi, and we will take turns in addressing different components of the presentation. Over to you, Dr. Lewin.
Thank you so much, DDG. Good morning to the honorable members, honorable chair. I haven't seen you all for a while. To my acting DG, the minister's office, everyone, nice to see you again. Thank you for this. And thank you very much, Dr. Sotikwa, for the introduction. I think it's important for grounding something that takes us back almost 20 years. And so it's been quite useful for us to reflect. And obviously, from the discussion, we'll be able to determine whether there's further, more in-depth work that we want to do. But as the department, we were able to collect some data quite easily. And other data, it might be something that we need to look at in the longer term, how we can gather more data and get you some more detailed information. But we hope this will at least assist. So I have the privilege of talking to you a little bit about the history of this process. And some of us were around at the time, although I was not working in the university space at this time, but I was in the department in 2002. And some of my colleagues may also remember that time. And I suspect there are people also on the portfolio committee who may not have been, who may have been very young when this process started. So the history goes really all the way back to the changes post 1994. And you may recall that the president had appointed a National Commission on Higher Education. That report came out in 1996, making recommendations to the president and the Ministry of Education at the time, led by Prof. Bengu, around how we should create a single coherent higher education system out of the apartheid landscape of higher education. And then, of course, that was then followed by the White Paper 3 on higher education transformation, which we all know quite well. It still remains relevant. It still remains a reference document for us. That white paper came out in 1997, of course, also the same year that the new Higher Education Act was first promulgated. What happened post the white paper is that the department was working towards a national plan for higher education. And at that time, there was a university education branch established in the department. Remember, the CHE started operating at that, once the act had been promulgated. And one of the first tasks that the CHE completed in its work was a task team report called Towards a New Higher Education Landscape. This document came out in 2000, and it provided a whole bunch of recommendations to the department and the ministry on what a higher education landscape might look like in a post-apartheid era. And that was then taken into account in the following work that was done, including, of course, the National Plan for Higher Education, which came out 21 years ago in 2001, and it provided a framework for the work of the white paper, the policy intent of the white paper in creating a single coordinated higher education system. And I I think this has been so fascinating for us to go back to this period and remember, you know, why this work was done and what was actually happening at the time. There was a huge, bigger higher education system, about 36 institutions, very, very racially divided. You know how the 1959 Universities Act came about and what it did to the higher education system. We know that we still see many of those effects in the system, but at this time, it was a very different kind of system. I remember even from the time that I was a student in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, how divided the universities were, how very different they were, and how different the conditions were across the universities. So the National Working Group was then appointed in March 2001, and that working group was appointed to specifically advise the minister at the time, who was Professor Asmal, on the restructuring of the institutional landscape of the higher education system. That report was released in February 2002. And in November 2002, Cabinet approved the restructuring proposals of the ministry. All of this documentation is available, and so we can go into more detail about it at another stage. What that then did is it laid the basis for the merger process that proceeded from there. And I'm going to show you a series of slides which will show you which mergers took place when, and then also which incorporations also took place. And it gives you a sense of how different the system was then. So most of the mergers, however, took place between 2004 and 2005. So the most recent mergers are already 17 years in the making, and so we've progressed quite significantly from the old system into a new single coordinated system. What also happened at the time was that merger unit was established in the Department of Education at the time, and that was a combination of expertise of people within the system, a range of expertise, particularly in areas such as financing, governance, academic issues, as well as HR in particular, because obviously these were all the areas in which the department needed to provide support to the merging institutions. The Council on Higher Education advice that I referred to that came out in 2000, this is the full title of the document, Towards a New Higher Education Landscape, Meeting the Equity, Quality and Social Development Imperatives of South Africa in the 21st Century. This document advised that the sustainability of the higher education system, including the effective and efficient use of resources, required a reduction in the present number of institutions through combining institutions. So the CHE advised, of course, on the reduction of the number of institutions. And this is so important because it really framed so much of the work at this time. The current landscape, and remember this is in 2000, an institutional configuration of higher education has its roots in an apartheid past, is inadequate to meet socioeconomic needs, and is no longer sustainable. South Africa does not have the human and financial resources to maintain the present institutional configuration. Senior and mid-level leadership, management and administrative capacities are missing or lacking in parts of the system. New patterns in students' enrollment mean that a number of institutions are at risk. Some institutions also do not satisfy the specification to continue as independent institutions. So you can see the beginning of the policy arguments for why the landscape needed to change. An inefficient system, a system that was unaffordable, a number of institutions that were not viable, massive change in patterns of student enrollments, which were absolutely essential post-1994, and essentially a higher education system that had its roots in a fully racist past. So necessary for that change to happen. The white paper vision of a single coordinated higher education system translated into 5 policy goals and strategic objectives, and these were expressed in the national plan. And I'll take you through these. The one was to increase access and to produce graduates with the skills and competencies necessary to meet the human resource needs of the country. And you'll remember at the time, of course, that the universities were serving a relatively small group of students. They were also serving students in racially divisive ways. So this was a massive policy goal of the country. Of course, it continues to be, to promote equity of access and outcomes, and to redress past inequalities through ensuring that the student and staff profiles reflect the demographic composition of South African society. Now, if we're going to go back to 2001, we can see how much progress has actually been made in the system. Yes, we still have issues around access. We still have issues around too many students not getting through and dropping out. And we still have inequalities in the system, based on class and race. But we certainly have made a huge difference. And what you've seen change most significantly in the past 10 years or so is the demographic profile also of the academic staff and the leadership of our public institutions. To ensure diversity in the institutional landscape of the higher education system through mission and program differentiation to meet national and regional needs and skills and knowledge needs. Now, this of course is something that has changed quite significantly, but it still remains an important policy goal. But it was a critical goal of the process of mergers and incorporations, to build high-level research capacity, including sustaining current research strength, as well as to promote research linked to national development needs. So very important that as well. And then this came out in the national plan very clearly, to build new institutional identities and organizational forms through restructuring the institutional landscape of the higher education system, thus transcending the fragmentation, the inequalities and the inefficiencies of the apartheid past, and to enable the establishment of South African institutions consistent with the vision and values of a non-racial, non-sexist and democratic society. So very, very important policy goals there expressed in the national plan, and very much guiding the work that took place in the early 2000s in relation to the mergers and incorporations, and of course the related policy goals, which were implemented in a number of other policy areas which accompany the mergers and incorporations process. And it's also very important to see these things as working together in the system. I'm going to go to what the national plan actually did. It was a framework and mechanisms for restructuring, as I've already indicated. There were very clear targets for the size and shape of the system. The targets around increasing participation rates for young people, shifting the balance between humanities, business and commerce, and science and engineering and technology, which had been achieved, and of course is still something that we keep a very close watching brief on. What was also signaled in the plan was the beginning of some specificity around the mergers. So the creation of a single dedicated distance education institution at the time was mentioned in the national plan, and this was proposed through the merger of UNISA, what was at the time Technicon SA, also predominantly a distance institution, and the distance education campus of Vista University, which was at the time called VUDEC. I'm not sure that all of you remember some of these institutions, how many of us remember Vista University and don't really think about UNISA. How many of us remember Rao, remember some of the other institutions which are now really well known to us as other institutions. There were specific restructuring measures also mentioned in the national plan, including the incorporation of Kwazulu, which was a campus at the time of the University of the North, or Turfloop as it was known then, of course becoming the University of Limpopo, and that incorporation into the Free State University, which is of course now the University of the Free State, and also the merger between ML Sultan Technicon and Natal Technicon in Durban, which was the first merger to take place, and in a sense a voluntary merger, and so quite an interesting case study for the mergers that were to come. And also in the national plan, the creation of national institutes, which of course still exist in our legislation, and ultimately laid the basis for the development of new universities in Pumalanga and Northern Cape. The National Institute for Higher Education in Pumalanga started in 2006 and Northern Cape in 2003. So just to refer to the National Working Group report, this is the one that came out in 2002, and it ended up, basically it was the engagement between this report, the CHE's advice, and the work of the ministry itself that ended up in the restructuring proposals that ultimately went to cabinet and were approved. And if you look at some of those early documents, you can see some of the thinking. Not all of the thinking at the time resulted in the landscape that we have now. There were tweaks here and there. There were certain proposals that were rejected at the time that were thought to be unviable. But it's interesting, if you look at the documentation, then to go back and see what some of those proposals were. Nonetheless, I mean, we as I say, we're 17 years on now. But the important thing about what the National Working Group referred to was that a restructured higher education system should be socially just and equitable in its distribution of resources and opportunities. It should meet the requirements of long-term sustainability, and it should embrace the productivity of the system through effectively and efficiently meeting the teaching, skills development and research needs of the country. So again, kind of echoing what the National Commission had said, echoing what the CHE had said in its advice, and of course, drawing from the national plan. The response of the ministry, as I've said, then there were some differences in opinion, but the response of the ministry ultimately resulted in the landscape that we now know. And I've indicated about the national institutes and when they were established. But it's important, honourable members, also to place the mergers and the incorporations in the full context of the restructuring and the transformation of higher education at the time. And this particularly in terms of the White Paper 3 and the National Plan from 1997 and 2001. And of course, also guided by the Higher Education Act, the fact that the CHE and the HEQC were being established, and of course, many later developments. From 2003, we had a new funding framework, the funding framework that by and large we're still working with now. And of course, we've had you know, a whole lot of policy changes and developments over that time. So it's also important to see the mergers and incorporations within that context. So maybe just to emphasize then the policy rationale for the mergers, clearly at the outset addressing social justice and the social and structural inequality, as well as the fragmentation that we had in the higher education system at the time that came about as a result of the apartheid legacy. That was a major, major policy goal at the time. I think that it's a policy goal that we could evaluate, but I think certainly now that we know that the institutional identities of the new institutions are fully established, that to some extent, that has been addressed. Of course, many of the structural inequalities we still see, and I'm sure that will come out in our discussion later on. The need for a comprehensive transformation of the higher education system, absolute rejection of a need for an absolute rejection of the past and the way in which institutions had been set up in racially and ethnic fashion, funded differently, operating differently, a real need to break from the past. The need to ensure efficiency and effectiveness comes through very strongly. At the time, a real concern that the affordability of the system and sustainability was not there, that you know, limited resources were not being properly utilized, and there was a duplication in academic programs. So something that also needed to be addressed. Absolute need to promote staff equity at the time. You will know that many of our institutions were predominantly staffed by white academics, mainly white male academics, and staff equity has been a major transformation goal over the last 20 to 25 years. Consolidating existing programs to enable a wider range of academic programs to be offered also in response to regional and national needs, and consolidating the deployment and use of academic personnel. Again, a feeling that there were inefficiencies in that area as well, and mitigating the effects of unnecessary competition. Universities naturally do compete with one another in a relatively small system where there are constrained skills, although obviously we are making a big dent in that at the moment, but certainly that was a concern at the time. Just a quick one to give you a sense of the old Department of Education and what kind of work it did to support the mergers. I've already indicated that there was a merger unit. That merger unit was appointed to oversee, to support institutions and to monitor the process of the mergers. There were also independent research projects that were set up outside of the department, which, you know, some of them were donor funded, and there was a great deal of interest there. There's quite a lot of literature that came out of that period and the post-merger period, which is useful for us to reflect on perhaps in a broader project. But certainly something that monitoring was very important, and the technical support was a big issue, particularly in areas around financing, around the merging of institutions and the merging of their finances, the merging of their human resources, and of course the need to align staff salaries and salary scales, etc. So very, very complicated issues. So the technical work of the merger unit was quite important at the time. Guidelines were produced at the time, merger guidelines to help institutions with the technical work. And there was also specific funding set aside, about just over 3 billion rand. Of course, at the time, that was a lot more than it is now, mainly split between the covering of the direct merger costs and also recapitalization of institutions. So institutions submitted bids for this money, and the financial support covered 3 distinct areas. The one was the recapitalization of institutions that were undercapitalized. And obviously, this was a very, very big issue at the time. It still remains something that we're concerned with. The other was the reimbursement of direct merger-related expenditure when there was a need to equalize institutions in particular ways, and that had to be done right up front in order to make the merger successful. Some of that was done. And then the third was costs associated with any restructuring of personnel that was considered necessary for the operational requirements of the new entity. So this work was done with National Treasury. There were very strict criteria developed, and the allocation of resources to institutions was done. And then the other thing that the ministry also did was to appoint a reference group. The reference group was also very important in terms of monitoring merger planning and the implementation processes on the ground, just to ensure that the central principles underpinning the restructuring were infused into the implementation process. The next slides will give you a sense of the mergers. And for those of you that were still very young at this time, it could be really, you probably know about these mergers, but it's really interesting to look back. The Durban University of Technology, as I said, initially called the Durban Institute of Technology. That merger took place before any of the other mergers. And so it provided information and support for the others, in the sense of that this had been done before and there was a lot that could be learned from it. And then in 2004, the series of mergers that took place, the first mergers, the University of Kwazulu-Natal, which was a merger between the old University of Natal and the University of Durban Westville. Probably those are well-known universities, but certainly for the last 18 years, we've had the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Northwest University, the Potchefstroom University for Christian Higher Education, the Potchefstroom campus now of Northwest University, the University of the Northwest, which was based in Mafeking, and the Sebokeng campus of Vista University. And you will probably know from what you know about the Northwest University that the university still has 3 main, it's a multi-campus institution, and it still has those 3 primary campuses, but it is a unitary Northwest University. The University of South Africa, I've already mentioned because it was mentioned specifically in the national plan. Tshwane University of Technology, a merger of 3 institutions fairly closely related. Tshwane actually has a lot more campuses now, but it was the Northwest Technicon, Technicon Northern Gauteng, and Pretoria Technicon. And that was also in January 2004. Walter Sisulu University, initially called Walter Sisulu University of Technology and Science, formed from the University of Transkei, Border Technicon, and Eastern Cape Technicon. Now, all of those are rural-based institutions, obviously all in the Eastern Cape. Institutions that were historically Black, historically disadvantaged. So that's interesting just to hold on to in terms of the mergers and what might have happened subsequent to that. Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, more recently they've dropped the Metropolitan, it's now Nelson Mandela University. That was the University of Port Elizabeth and Technicon Port Elizabeth, both of which were very close together in spatial terms. And these are the second wave of mergers that took place in 2005. The Cape Peninsula University of Technology, a merger between Peninsula Technicon, which, as you know, was very close to the University of the Western Cape, and Cape Technicon, which had a number of campuses. University of Johannesburg, from the Rand Afrikaans University. Some of you may remember the Vista University Distance Education Campus in Soweto, and the Technicon Witwatersrand. Those three institutions formed the University of Johannesburg. University of Limpopo was formed from the University of the North and the Medical University of South Africa, which is based in Ga-Rankuwa. And of course, as you know, that later became a demerger, and Medunsa, the old Medunsa, and now the Sefako Makgato Health Sciences University much later on. Now, incorporations are also very interesting to look at. The University of Port Elizabeth incorporated the Vista University Port Elizabeth campus of Vista University, University of Pretoria, the Mamelodi campus of Vista, University of the Free State, the Bloemfontein campus of Vista, having of course already incorporated as Free State University the Kwakwa campus of the University of the North, the Central University of Technology, the Welkom campus, which is why that CUT now has two campuses, Welkom and Bloemfontein. Rao incorporated the Vista University Soweto campus in 2004, just prior to becoming the University of Johannesburg. University of Fort Hare incorporated the University, Rhodes University's East London campus, and the University of Stellenbosch Faculty of Dentistry was absorbed into the University of the Western Cape. So those incorporations took place 2003, 2004. And of course, you can hardly see those things now, but it does explain some of the multi-campus institutions, and it certainly explains some of the issues, perhaps at UNISA, if you look back to the incorporation of Vista. Honorable members, we assume that you would be interested in this series of slides, which is to, it doesn't give you a full sense of some of the governance challenges, but we know that where there are governance challenges at institutions and there's a ministerial intervention, that we do need to keep a record of this. And it's interesting if you look at this record, because as much as there are some universities in the merged group that have had interventions over time, and this slide and the next will show you which they are, there are equally universities that were never part of the mergers or the incorporations that have also faced interventions, whether institutional assessors or administration. And so you can see from this slide, and so we go back to before the merger period, the University of the North had an assessment, and the University of Durban Westville had an assessment back in 2000 and 2003. And then from the merger, Durban University of Technology, which of course had been merged since 2002, there was an assessment at that university in 2007. Again, quite shortly after the merger, there was an assessment at the University of Limpopo. In 2008, Mangosuthu University of Technology, and that assessment resulted in an administration period. At the Tshwane University of Technology, which is a merged institution, also that assessment resulted in an administration. University of Zululand was not part of the merger or incorporation process, but it did go under administration for a period. Walter Sisulu University, yes, indeed a merged university, and yes, it did also go under administration. But now if you look at this slide, and now this slide is the later group from 2012 to 2020, you have Central University of Technology, you have VAL ultimately going into administration as well very recently, and once before, Mangosuthu University of Technology, again another assessment, and again another assessment. We've had 3 assessments at MUT, and two periods of administration. And then University of Fort Hare, yes, a period of administration as well, and VAL again, 2 periods of administration. But neither of those, in fact, none of these institutions were subject to the mergers. CUT, as you know, had 1 incorporation, but none of these other institutions were subject to the mergers. If you take into account the fact that there is a discussion about UNISA and an assessment there at the moment, then UNISA, but of course that appointment has not yet been made, and therefore we haven't put it in this table. Honorable members, the next slides are going to go into the financial health. So we've looked very a very high level at the governance. And I think you can see from the governance that it's a very mixed picture. You can't necessarily say that it was the mergers per se that led to, or the incorporations that led to the periods of assessment or administration at any university. And you can see equally that a number of institutions that were not merged have also faced ministerial intervention. So it's not very clear cut that the mergers had a particular effect on the governance structures, although of course there were governance challenges that have been documented through literature, and we can look at those, but certainly nothing necessarily distinguishing merged institutions from others. Now, if you look at financial health, it's interestingly very much the same thing. And what we're doing here, honorable members, is not comparing these institutions to the overall institutions. And we don't do this in analytical work in order to compare institutions. We do this analytical work in order to understand what the system is looking like, understand what are the kinds of trends and struggles that our institutions are going through, understand how institutions are operating financially, and to raise red flags for ourselves, which we would then use to triangulate information with other sources of information where we would have concerns about universities. But essentially, this data comes from the annual audited financial statements, which are presented to the institutions. All of this is public information, but what we are presenting here is our analysis of that, and it's analysis that we do in terms of these key financial indicators. We actually have a much longer list of financial indicators that we've looked at, but here we just have picked just some of the high level ones. So in terms of this, what we want to just say up front is that we're not comparing here merged institutions with non-merged. So the kinds of trends you're seeing here are trends that you would see across the whole sector. So we're not necessarily making a finding about the fact that merged institutions have particular challenges. In any case, you will see how different the financial status is of the different universities. But that comparison is something that would need to be done separately. It's something that would probably take some time. Just in terms of this, we show the surplus trends. So this is the operating surplus and deficit history. We've only, as the acting DG said, we've only done this over a 5-year period. And the reason for that is just because we do have information going back, but it's going to take us a bit of time we didn't have a lot of time to collate all the information, and we also didn't want to overwhelm with data. So the DHET expected normal standard in terms of a surplus is that ideally there should be a surplus set by council. And the main reason for this is that we have to university has to be shielded from any unforeseen revenue shortfalls or any over expenditure that happens. So it's very important for universities to build some form of investment so that they are able to be able to support themselves should there be short and long-term requirements of the institution. It's essentially about just being going concerns, and this has to be at least 1% of recurrent income. So that's an important indicator for us, just to see that institutions are able to keep some kind of operating surplus, and the council is paying attention to this issue. The second one looks at subsidies and grants ratio, which is very important for us to get a sense of the match between income from the state subsidy, which is the mainstream of income for most universities, the second stream income, which is income from tuition fees, and the third stream income, which is income from other sources. It's often ring-fenced funding, but also donor funding and other endowments and things like that. But it's very important that we watch the trends around this so that we can see how universities are able to get funds in terms of the different streams of income and how those income streams change. It also gives us a sense of how universities are dependent on the state, both in terms of their income from subsidy, as well as now, of course, more and more in terms of their income from tuition fees, given the new NSFAS funding regime since 2018. The tuition fees ratio, ideally, what we want is a ratio of less than 35%. What you don't want is a proportion where fee income is very, very high, because it also means then that fees are probably too high, and that there's a problem there with balancing the income. But it provides an overview of the tuition and accommodation fees as a percentage. And obviously also the financial sustainability of the system is dependent on this kind of ratio. The merger guidelines for personnel cost to income provides for a ratio of 57.5 to 63%. So what you want ideally is a total personnel cost to income in that range. If it goes above that range, you know, the university is at threat in terms of the dependency, you know, on keeping staff costs and being able to pay staff. But as long as it's within that ratio, it's fine. And universities know these ratios and they work with them. Sorry, third stream income ratio is generally less than 20%. And of course, it's highly variable across institution. The next really important ratio that we look at is student debt. And I think you can see from the following slides that I'll show you just how big of an issue this is in the system. And we know from what we've talked to you before about just how big student debt is of a problem. And what the student debt ratio shows you is how able is an institution to manage student debt. And what is an acceptable level is around 20% of gross student debt as a percentage of fees charged. And this includes accommodation. But of course, you'll see that many institutions are actually outside of that, which means that at the current time, student debt is a major issue for all our public institutions. Chairperson, I'm going to go on and focus a little bit on these slides, but I don't want to overwhelm. I'm sure you've had a chance also to look at some of these things, and if there are questions, of course, we're very, very happy to answer them. I think UKZN generated an operating surplus of 766 million. This is in 2020. So if you look at our slides, we're going back from 2020, which is the latest audited data. We have now received the 2021 annual reports, and we are in the process of analyzing the data, financial health data for 2021, and that report will be available towards the end of this calendar year. You can see, of course, in year growth in 2020, the percentage growth was down, but what we're looking at also in the last column there is a 5-year average, which gives you a sense that there has been, you know, growth in income over that period. The total surplus expressed as a percentage of the total income for UKZN is 12.5% in 2020. And the year-on-year average growth is at 9.2%. Year-on-year average increase in income amounts to 8.1% over the 5-year period. State subsidy, of course, is the largest portion of revenue streams. This is the case for most of our institutions, contributing on average 43% to income in proportion to the consolidated pool of funding and the student income to the extent of 36.6%, and the remaining 20.3% is represented by third stream income. This is not a bad third stream income for an institution at all. It's a relatively good looking institution. Year-on-year expenditure increased on average about over 6.3% over the 5-year period. Personnel costs as a percentage of total income are 44.2% on average. Actually, this is kind of below what the norm is. Council controlled personnel costs 50.1%, again below, but increased by 7.6% over the 5-year period. Now, student debt at UKZN, and you will have heard this from engaging with the institution, very high problem for the university. So student debt before impairment accounts for 70.1% of gross tuition and accommodation fees. So it's a massive challenge for the university. The audit opinions, you can see, have been consistent over time, unqualified with findings over all the period of the years that we're showing here. So, you know, obviously the findings are looked at, but unqualified audit is something that we would expect from a relatively well-run institution. And that's what we are saying it is. Now, Nelson Mandela University comes in next. Nelson Mandela University, I just want to see my notes here. Very good audit findings, as you can see, unqualified with no audit findings. An operating surplus of 294 million. Of course, what you'll also see is that the operating surplus is in numbers. That's why we look at the percentages, because the numbers differ so vastly. The size of the institutions and their budgets differ so vastly as well. UKZN, obviously a much bigger institution than NMU in terms of student numbers. but there was a decrease of operating expenditure of 35.8 in 2020. But again, if you look at the 5-year average, it averages out at 67.5 as a total operating surplus, and then at 67.5. Yeah, so that's good. Total surplus expressed as a percentage of the total income is 9.7%, and the year-on-year average growth as a percentage of income is 11.4%. So relatively stable there, and an increase in income of 8.2% over the 5-year period. So I think you can also see, maybe what's also important to see is that in 2018 and 2019, universities did receive significant additional subsidy, given the changes that were introduced in 2018. And of course, that subsequently, of course, you've seen reductions. So 2020, you can see there's also reduction in income from the state. From what was initially going to be expected as the growth. Personnel costs as a percentage of total income, 49.1% on average, and as council controlled personnel costs is 55.9%, so very close to the norm period. So that's a stable indicator, an indicator of stability. It did increase by 9.6% over the 5-year period, which is not surprising. Student debt before impairment is 25.7. That indicates the university is managing their debt relatively well. It's lower than a lot of other institutions. And of course, they've got unqualified opinions. So NMU, relatively stable. I think you'll also recall, maybe I won't bring the issue in now, but the issue of where mergers took place between historically advantaged and historically disadvantaged institutions. If we are thinking back 17 years to the mergers, it is possible in some ways to see those trends, because if you go back to the policy goals and the need to try and redress structural equality, you can see that those institutions that were more equal than others at the time that have been able to operate relatively well over this period. But you can see the HDI trends in some ways coming through. But of course, you can see them coming through if you look at the broader system as well. So the next slide is Northwest University. Northwest University, mainly the merger between the old University of Northwest in Mafeking and the Potchefstroom Christian Higher Education University in Potchefstroom, and then also the Sebokeng campus of Vista. And Northwest had a significant operating surplus of 1.152 billion. This makes it very stable. It makes it a total operating surplus over a 5-year period is 85.3. So certainly no particular sustainability worries at that institution. Total surplus expressed as a percentage of total income is 22.4% for 2020, and the year-on-year average growth on surpluses is 15.4%. So you can see this is higher than both the two previous institutions shown. Year-on-year average increase in income, much the same as the other institutions at 8.1%. State subsidy, of course, though still the largest proportion of the revenue stream, contributing 41.2% on average to income, and pool of funding and student fees income to the extent of 33%. The remaining 25.1% is third stream income, also a relatively good income from third stream, over at least over the 20% that we're hoping for. And personnel costs, as council controlled personnel costs, 52.5, so also just below the norm, no, not doing too badly at all. Student debt, relatively well managed at 16.2%. So not as big a problem there as it is at other institutions. And also unqualified audits with no findings at all. So from an audit perspective, university doing quite well. UNISA, obviously an enormous institution, and generating an operating surplus of 1.726 billion. Again, one needs to look, at the size of the institution when you look at the numbers, but you can see the 5-year average is really quite high, 179.4%. So a big growth there in operating surplus. So good for the stability of the institution, and the percentage of total income surplus as a percentage of total income 17.6% for 2020, and a year-on-year average growth slightly higher than other institutions at 9.9% is an average increase in income. State subsidy, still the largest portion of the revenue stream, 43.8%, and student and funding income at 43.3%, and then the remaining 12.9% is third stream income. So relatively low there, but there are other institutions that are low. There have been unqualified audits, but with findings. So obviously issues that the university is paying attention to there. Then UJ, now University of Johannesburg, the merger of the old Rand Afrikaans University, the Soweto campus of Vista and Wits Technicon, which is now where the Doornfontein campus of UJ is. UJ generating a significant operating surplus of 767 million, an increase of 8.3%, and the average growth over the 5 years is 516.3%. This is a very high level of growth. So obviously the institution has been concentrating very much on ensuring, that it's able to remain sustainable in the long term. So particular strategy there by the institution. Total surplus expressed as a percentage of the total income is 13.8%. The average increase in income is 7.5% over the 5-year period, so slightly lower than some of the other institutions. State subsidy, again, the largest proportion of revenue stream, on average 41.7%, and then student fee income around 37.1% of the total, and a relatively good source of third stream income around 21.2%. Year-on-year expenditure increased on average at 5.9% over the 5-year period, which is relatively low. Personnel costs, very much within the range. Council-controlled personnel costs at 57.3. It's slightly lower when you look at all personnel costs at a percentage of total income. But again, personnel costs increasing over the period by an average of 7.9%. Student debt before impairment accounts for 19.3%. That's not bad. It's obviously something that's being very carefully managed. And of course, unqualified audits with no findings. So no big issues with the auditors at the University of Johannesburg, and relatively stable indicators. What's the Sulu University? Very interesting, as I said, because it was a merger of 3 rural-based universities, historically disadvantaged universities, as you know, a very spread out institution. And as the chair indicated, an institution that there's been a lot of attention on recently because of the discussion around the restructuring needed, as well as the consolidation of their both financially and their campus and academic programs, and their need to be sustainable. So again, of course, if you look at their total operating surplus, you look at a completely different picture from the other institutions. So an operating surplus of only 140 million in 2020, slightly lower than in 2019, which was 195 million, a decrease of 28.3% in 2020 against the average negative growth. So if you look at the 5-year period, you've got a negative growth, a very, very high negative growth. So big concerns there about the operating surplus of WUSU. Income ratios, not surprising at all, a relatively high proportion of income ratios in terms, in favor of government subsidy. Also, revenue streams from student fees, tuition and accommodation fees at 49%, quite high, and the remaining only 2.7% of third stream income. So it shows you the struggle that many universities have with getting third stream income in. And the total surplus expressed as a percentage of the income is only at 5.5% for 2020. So obviously an issue that the university is paying big attention to. Year-on-year expenditure increased at quite a high level of 11.6 over the 5-year period, and also personnel costs as a percentage of total income at 64%. So on the high end of the acceptable ratio, but not too high. It could be higher than that, but it's relatively okay. But it is pushing the high end of the ratio that we perceive to be acceptable. And of course, your student debt before impairment, 103% of gross tuition and accommodation fees. So highly, highly, highly unsustainable levels of student debt, and really, really a massive concern for the university. Very interesting about Walter Sisulu, and I think something very worth noting. If you look at the audit outcomes of Walter Sisulu, in 2016, Walter Sisulu had a qualified audit. 2017, they had a disclaimed audit. 2018, they had a qualified audit. But in 2019, they turned it around completely with an unqualified audit with findings, and again in 2020, an unqualified audit with findings. So if you look at their audit opinions since 2016, a massive improvement, and really something worth, worth acknowledging and celebrating in the university. But of course, as you can see, the financial challenges facing Walter Sisulu are very severe, and perhaps provide you with a background to some of the discussions that you have seen more recently. Durban University of Technology generated an operating surplus of 682 million, which is a decrease of 3.2 in 2020, but the 5-year average is fine at 41.9%. Operating surplus as a percentage of total income at 22.5, average of the 5 years. Income ratios, the average increase in income quite high at 14.1%. State subsidy, of course, as goes the trend across institutions, 44.2% average, and this consolidated pool of funding and student income around 42.4%, and the remaining 13.3% is third stream income. Not bad, not bad in the scope of universities of technology at all, but obviously there's room for improvement there as well. Year-on-year expenditure increased by 10.6% on the 5-year period. Personnel costs, in terms of council personnel costs, 49.9% on average, so quite low actually over the average there. But student debts, very high, 61.3%, and audit opinions quite quite important to have increased, unqualified with findings, unqualified with findings, but had been unqualified with no findings. So perhaps the audits there, something worth looking at DHET. I think the next slide should be on Tshwane University of Technology. Obviously one of our biggest contact institutions, if I'm correct, nearly 60,000 students, an operating surplus of only 32 million in 2020, very small amount. You can see there that the percentage is a minus of 92.4%, but the 5-year average 22.1%. But certainly operating surplus, an issue that requires some attention and is an issue of concern for us. Total surplus as a percentage of total income is only 0.7% for 2020. What this signals is a concern around sustainability going forward. So something we have to take very, very particular attention to. An average increase in income, much the same as other institutions at 8.3. State subsidy, obviously the biggest contribution. In 2020, 57.6, but the average over 5 years, 52.6, so highly dependent on the state subsidy. Tuition and accommodation fees, 35.6%, and third stream income, more or less in the same range as most of the universities of technology, around 11.8%. And audit findings unqualified, but last year with findings, before that with no findings. So certainly some concerns there in terms of the long-term sustainability. Cape Peninsula University of Technology, the merger between Cape Technicon, a former advantaged institution, and Peninsula Technicon, a disadvantaged institution, a very small 5-year average operating surplus at 6.7%, and an operating 20 total surplus as a percentage of the total income is only 3.2%. So worrying there as well in terms of a relatively small growth of operating surplus, a high dependency on state income at 51.7%, so over over 50%, tuition and accommodation fees at 36.2. This is the 5-year average, and third stream income at 12.2. Again, you can see that most of the UOTs are hovering around the sort of mid-teens in terms of their third stream income, which is not bad. Certainly room for improvement as much as possible. Personnel costs at CPUT within the range, like maybe slightly below the range at 55.6. But if you look at council-controlled personnel costs, it's actually 67% on average, which is quite high compared to what it should be. So certainly something there to look at. The difference between the two is that the council-controlled, would be all the personnel. Sometimes you're looking at personnel costs. You've got personnel that are not covered through other forms of funding, third stream, research income, etc. So that's where the difference comes in. Student debt ratios really high at CPUT and a big area of concern, 82% before impairment as an average over the 5 years. But the university has obtained unqualified audit findings over the period, and sometimes with findings as in 2020. I think, Chair, this is the last one, so you don't get completely overwhelmed with figures. The last one is SMU. Now, SMU, as you know, was until 2014, was part of, 2015, was part of University of Limpopo. The demerger took place, and it is now the Sefako Makgatho Health Sciences University. It's a very small university, and you can see that it has been something that's needed specific attention and support from us, because a relatively small, in fact, a very low operating surplus. And so the demerger process has obviously also raised issues around sustainability of the institution. This has been something that the department has been paying quite close attention to. Dependency on state subsidies is very high, an average of 61% over the 5-year period. Tuition and accommodation fees at 27%, so also relatively low tuition and accommodation fees. It's obviously an institution with very specialized skills, so you can see that also in terms of the council-controlled personnel costs, that the 5-year average is around 70%. But what you can see is that 5-year average is coming down since 2016, so that there is attention being paid to that percentage, so that we're not too concerned about that. But obviously sustainability a big concern around SMU, and we have had a qualified audit in 2016, which perhaps not surprising given when the demerger took place, but unqualified with findings since then. Student debt is a massive problem for the university at 143% in 2020 of income from gross tuition and accommodation fees. So very, very concerning there in terms of sustainability. Chairperson, before I hand over to, I just want to make a couple of points on the finances before I forget, and before hand over to the next section. The Auditor General does not audit the universities. Auditor General plays a watching brief over the audits of the universities. So we do, of course, share the audit reports, the annual financial statements with the Auditor General, and there's a watching brief. We haven't seen any of those. If they do produce any reports, we don't see them, but certainly there's, a growing interest in that. But what I want to say about this picture is that what we're not showing you is every single institution in the system. And if we are to go now and try and compare institutions pre-merger and post-merger, there's going to be very, very difficult from a data point of view, particularly in terms of the finances. So I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's going to be very interesting. And what we might want to do is to just compare this in terms of the whole system, because you can see there's 2 or 3 institutions that we're very concerned about. And there's some institutions where we're massively concerned about student debt. There's a couple of institutions where the sustainability is an issue of concern, and you can see that. But as a whole, if you look at the merged institutions as a whole, it's a very mixed picture, and it's not a standardized picture at all. And of course, that then goes back to the history of how institutions were merged, which institutions were merged, how financially sustainable were those institutions, how stable were they in terms of other things, like their ability to charge student fees at a particular level, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's a very mixed picture, and that's kind of what we wanted to do, but hopefully it does give you a helpful sense. And there's a lot more data where that comes from, but I think probably that was enough for one presentation. And Chairperson, thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to Faisal, and then Faisal will ultimately hand back to Dr. Sotikwa, who will then conclude for us. Thanks very much. I'll do the next bit for you, Faisal.
Okay. Thanks again, Tandy. Good morning to the Portfolio Committee and good morning to the Deputy Minister as well as colleagues that's on the platform. Basically, I will be taking you through the effects of the merger in terms of its academic enterprise. And by this, I mean basically in terms of the programs that is being offered as a result of the mergers now. If we look specifically in terms of the Gauteng province, and we look now at the University of Johannesburg, this was basically, as Tandy indicated, formed out of the merger of RAU as well as Technicon Witwatersrand and the Soweto campus of Vista University. Now, if you take into account that RAU was typically a traditional university with programs in the following fields of study, basically in languages, business, commerce, and management, law, life and physical sciences, education, and philosophy and theology, to name but a few. Now, when this was combined, institutions were combined with Wits Tech, for example. Wits Tech had a strong presence in vocational and career-orientated fields, especially in terms of architecture, environmental design, visual and performing arts, as well as information and communication technology, engineering, and also qualifications in hospitality. So as a result, you'll find that UJ's PQM now currently shows a well-balanced mix of both academic/research as well as career vocational and professional qualifications and learning programs. So just to give you an idea, in terms of the classification of universities, you normally get traditional, and then also we refer to as University of Technology and comprehensive. So the traditional universities tend to focus more in terms of have an academic focus. The University of Technology has more got a vocational career-orientated focus, and then the comprehensive is basically a combination of the two. So if we go on to the next slide, Danny, if we can just move to the next slide. Then if we look, for example, at the University of Limpopo, which was basically formed by the merger of Medunsa as well as the University of the North in around about 2005. And just taking into account that these two universities are roughly about 300 kilometers apart. The two institutions were demerged, as Tandy indicated, forming the Soweto Mokgato Health Sciences, which became a standalone university and with a primary focus in terms of health sciences. Tshwane University of Technology was formed around about in 2004 with the merger of Technicon Northern Gauteng as well as Technicon Northwest and Technicon Pretoria. And these are basically the same institutional types and also gave rise to a fairly well-balanced program qualification mix, which actually complements each other and closes the gaps in the various curricula that was being offered. Just to give an idea in terms of Technicon North Gauteng, for example, did not have qualifications in agriculture. Now, through this merger, it then expands the academic offerings. UNISA was the merger between is the merger of University of South Africa and Technicon South Africa, which resulted in UNISA's program qualification mix being more orientated to vocational career-orientated qualifications. If we move on to the next slide. Now, if we look in terms of the Kwazulu-Natal Province, the University of KZN was basically the merger of Natal University, University of Durban, Westville, and before the merger, University of Durban, Westville was not active in agriculture, architecture, visual and performing arts, and also in terms of libraries and museums. So when the merger came about, you would find that you ended up with an academically richer program offering, as UKZN now offers these qualifications in terms of agriculture, health sciences, and visual and performing arts. If we look in terms of the Durban University of Technology, which is basically the merger of the Natal Technicon and ML Sultan Technicon, this merger also produced a richer academic architecture with ML Sultan on its own did not have qualifications in terms of agriculture and education. When we look in terms of the Western Cape, the merger here was came about between the merger of Cape and Peninsula Technicons, which gave rise to the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And these two programs offerings are mutually benefit to both institutions. Coming to the new institution. If we move on, then if we look now specifically in terms of the Eastern Cape and we focus on Walter Sisulu, this was basically the merger between the University of Transkei, Eastern Cape and Border Technicons, and also came out as a rationalization and merger between UNITRA, Border and the Eastern Cape Technicons in 2005. And I think what we need to take into account that if you look in terms of the spread of the campuses, is roughly about 1,000-kilometer radius in which you find all of the campuses of Walter Sisulu. So just to give an idea, if you travel from one side to the other side, it's roughly in terms of 10 hours of driving. If you look in terms of the distance that's been covered, then you've got, for example, the campuses Mthatha, Ibika, which is in Butterworth, and you've got Buffalo City campus, which is in East London, and the Kumani campus, which is situated in Kumani. Now, HUSU's PQM shows a distinct university as well as a combination of the University of Technology types of qualifications. When we look at Nelson Mandela University, this was basically a result of the merger of the Port Elizabeth Technicon and the University of Port Elizabeth, and also as well as the Vista University. And this gave rise to a combination of traditional as well as University of Technology type qualifications with a fairly good articulation pathways across these qualifications. If we then now move on to the next slide, which then now looks at Northwest University. This was basically formed as a merger between the Potchefstroom University for Christian Higher Education and the University of Northwest, which was formerly the University of Botswana. The PQM of Northwest is evolving from a faculty-based campus offerings to offerings with similar programs across its rural and urban-based campuses. And the Higher Education Qualification Sub-Framework aligned PQM shows that the sites of delivery is quite evident that the Northwest University's offerings are becoming comparable across all its campuses as we move forward into the future. If we look in terms of Free State, the University of Free State was merged with the Kwakwa campus and the Bloemfontein Vista campus, and its PQM is evolving to ensure that there's comparability in terms of academic offerings across both its urban and its rural campus. And there's also a visible shift in the PQM to more qualifications at the Kwakwa campus. If we then move over to the next slide. Now, the next three slides basically gives you an indication in terms of how the number of institutions have changed. And I think you also need just to take note in terms of the enrollments. The enrollments went slightly up and then it came down and stabilized. So in 2003, there were 35 institutions, which was spread up and could then be categorized in terms of historically Black universities, historically white universities, and then similarly in terms of Technicons and also in terms of distance education. So you could see this was basically the profile pre-merger. If we then move on to 2004, we then see that the number of institutions now starts decreasing because mergers are now taking place. And then you find, for example, that in 2004, we've got now 29 institutions, and we now start to see a distinct profile taking place, that we've got our universities, our Technicons, or we refer to it as University of Technology now, and also the Distance University, which is basically now primarily focused on University South Africa. In 2005, we now see the 29 institutions dropping further down to 23 institutions. And this is basically the signaling of the end of the merger period. And now you've got distinctly, you've got your universities of technology, as well as your Distance University, University of South Africa. Now, just to take into account, in 2005, we added 23 institutions. As we move forward in time, you get the other 3 institutions that now starts coming on board, which is basically the Sol Plaatje University, University of Pumalanga, as well as the Sofatu Mahatu Health Sciences University. If we look at the next slide, the next two slides basically gives you an indication in terms of what was the models that was proposed in terms of how these institutions should function. So predominantly you find that we went on the unitary model, but just to give an idea, what was the problems with the federal merger model and why it was not the merger of choice? Because it was felt that if you had to implement the federal merger model, you'd find that there'd be a serious conflict and disruption, especially when you've got autonomous campuses now wanting to compete, especially for limited pool of resources and finances. And also, if you look in terms of and the international experience, you find that existing federal structures have been getting weaker as a result of member institutions competing for more and more to get power from the center. And this then also requires additional institutional structures that have to be set up, especially in terms of administrative and a governance aspect, taking into account that you have to replicate this now going through. Also, that at the time, it was not advisable, also given the historically black and historically white institutions and the legacy of apartheid, and that there might be an allegiance in terms of the existing institutional identities, especially when you look in terms of historically black and historically white institutions. And this would most probably have resulted in conflict and also in terms of a recipe for disaster, especially when we had to come to identify how resources was distributed. So if you look in terms of the model of choice, which was basically the unitary merger model, there were also some advantages and disadvantages also, that if, for example, you had an institution with a strong brand that was now merged, that there was the possibility of that institution actually losing its academic image or brand. And this could also affect it in terms of its national and international relationships. But this also gave us an opportunity for strong leadership to develop a new academic image and organizational identity, which could then inspire staff, attract students, and ensure the continuation of a national and international partnerships as we move forward. Also, if you look in terms of an international experience, unitary structures have been more successful than federal structures. And it also tends to be more effective in developing and promoting academic coherence, also ensure in terms of cost efficiencies, economies of scale, and ensuring institutional loyalty and stability. Also, when we look in terms of the institutional arrangements, you also find that we have more streamlined administrative and governance structures, and also the better utilization of scarce administrative and managerial skills, which you find, for example, within the sector, and this then allowed it to be distributed across the various campuses. It's also to take into account that this was essential given the South African context in terms of new institutional identities that we needed to transcend in terms of race and ethnic divides of the past. And therefore you find, for example, that the unitary merger model was the option that was chosen. I'd like now to hand over to Dr. Sokikwa to take us through the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As we indicated in our opening remarks, that part of the motivation was by the second administration was to build a high-level research capacity to address the research and knowledge needs of South Africa. And this representation before us really speaks to the research publications output from 1988 to 2003. And really, I think that the projection here speaks to all the universities. Now, if we look at the merged institutions, you can see the weaknesses that concerned the second administration at the time. Next slide. The former marks the slides also speak to the to the descent, rather to the use of the SUPS formula, which we used then to collect data, and the commencement of the process of institutional mergers, except for Durban Institute of Technology, which was a voluntary merger between Natal Technicon and ML Sultan Technicon, later to be known as Durban University of Technology, which took place prior to the rest of other mergers. Also, the historically disadvantaged universities starting from University of Durban Westville in the previous graph produced relatively lower research outputs, as I indicated. I think we can move on. The research outputs at the Technicons 1998 to 2003 are also presented here. I won't go into detail of it, but you can see from the numbers presented that Free State Tech certainly produced more than Durban Tech, for example, and progressively has in fact produced more over time. So all the resistance against the mergers were discounted by the continuous growth. You can see, yes, they plummeted in 2000, in the year 2000, but by 2002, they had reached double-digit figures. The same would apply, cannot apply to the other universities. We can see Durban University of Technology, their research outputs have dropped over time, and the same would apply with Cape Tech. We could not get some of the data for the institutions where there are gaps. But overall, if one compares the total figures, we can see an improvement. The research, I think this slide is self-explanatory. Thandi, can we move to the next slide? The research outputs at the historically advantaged institutions also are self-explanatory. You can see that on average, they excelled in their research outputs. And of course, some of the fears at the time, that is in 2002, was that merging was going to destabilize outputs. And in fact, the national international status of research of these institutions would be impacted. But we can see that over time, this has not been so. Can move to the next slide. Then a specific focus on historically disadvantaged institutions, and here focusing in particular not to the ones we've been discussing earlier, but UWC, University of Durban Westville, Univen, University of Fort Hare, then Madunsa, UniZulu, and UNITRA. You can see that, in fact, it has been vacillating from poor outputs to improved outputs. But generally, if one takes an average, it is improved over time. If we can move to the next slide, please. Let's skip the next slide. Looking at this particular slide and focusing specifically on UKZN, UJ, Stellenbosch, UP, UCT, BITS, RAU, and University of Orange Free State, we can see that the research output has in fact increased over time. We decided specifically not to rank the universities here. That is, I think, for a presentation for another day, Chair. But all we were focusing on is whether the institutions' research publications improved, Also, this particular graph represents the headcount per institution. And for most of them, it's actually double in terms of the research publication units. Thank you. Next one. Again, here the slide speaks to per capita research publication outputs below the sector average institutions in 2020, and they are listed, Chair. I won't go into details. I think the background we've provided thus far speak to some of the reasons, but we are concerned about the universities that are listed, and we have started to support them. I'll speak to the support in the later slides. Please, next slide. Overall, if one looks at the sector, it is a positive trajectory going upwards with a few dips, and there are various reasons therefore, but overall, I think it presents a positive picture. Can we move to the next slide? So earlier on, Chair, I indicated that we are supporting the universities that are struggling. And as you would know, we established the University Capacity Development Program, and the New Generation of Academics program in particular. If one looks at the allocations in total across the 26 universities, we are sitting at 759, but with specific focus to the merged institutions, the posts filled to date with this intervention, the numbers are self-explanatory, but you can see the level of support on average sitting at in the late 20s and vacillating between 21 to 35. Thank you. Next slide. Then in terms of the Nurturing Emerging Scholars program, overall here we have supported 105 candidates. And again, if we look at how those candidates feature in the merged institutions, I think it's self-evident, on average of 4 per institution. We can move to the next slide, please. Then the Future Professors Program, and as you know, Chair, if you recall, we indicated that we are concerned with the aging cohort of professors in this domain. Overall, we've had a total of 85 academics participating in this program, and the growth, yes, it may seem small on face value, but I believe the impact, and given the length of time it takes to develop professors, I think the impact will be felt if we continue with a level of funding and support to make this impact. So participation in the University Development Program Chair projects, UJ, if we then look at specifically how the collaborative projects have evolved, in UJ we have Future Professors Program Phase 2, having concluded Phase 1 recently, the establishment of the South African National Resource Centre for the first year experience and students in transition, and then secondly the developing and piloting a teaching advancement at the university through TAO, a fellowship project. At WUSU, we have the enhancing staff capacity towards knowledge exchange in engineering, education and practice. And again, this speaks to the input Mr. Tovey was making around the program qualification mix. at DUT, unfurling post-school education and training, which is really speaks to the articulation project. And we are really happy with the progress around articulation from through the different institutional levels, and the work underway there is exciting. We do not have projects at UNISA. At CPUT, we have the Dual Higher Education Project, again, as part of our intervention. At TUT, the South African Technology Network, SATN, USDP project. And again, in UKZN is the Teacher Education offered at DUT, UniZulu, and through the assistance of University of Iowa, Mandela University. We have support for the university staff to acquire doctorates in business management and administration, higher education management degrees. At Northwest University, none thus far. At University of the Orange Free State, we have the Mountains Research through USDP. We have Univen working with UFS. We have support from Colorado State University, the Appalachian State University, and University of Montana, supporting the work that is underway there. And then we're promoting student success through the Academic Advising National Collaborative Project. And through the University of Limpopo, we have the Global Health. Obviously, University of Limpopo, in conjunction with Univen, getting support from University of Virginia. And can we move? So overall, Chair, I think that is just to indicate the level of effort to attend to the key policy challenges that were observed and articulated over time. We are on a transformation trajectory, and I think we can do better. And we concede that we can do better, but a lot of work is underway. We are currently assessing the reports from the institutions, and as Tandi indicated, they were reporting on governance through the teaching and learning unit. We will then be able to provide audited information based on the reports we've just received on how the universities have responded over time. Next slide, please. In conclusion, Chair, at the time of the mergers and incorporations, there was a recognition of the broad areas of challenge facing institutions. There was great resistance, and you know, I went back through the literature. It was really phenomenal that we could have overcome the resistance from different players. And some of this ranged from universities and certain stakeholders complaining about religious rights, language rights being eroded, academic performance being eroded. And we can see that really over time, this has not happened. Yes, the challenges are, and some of them continue to persist, around harmonization of salaries, governance and management structures, multi-campus institutions, and indeed recapitalization was necessary. We indicated that 3 billion was committed, and if one looks at the state of the institutions then, with several institutions really struggling financially. I actually recall how University of Western Cape had I think a shortfall of 192 million. That was in around 2002, and how they've recovered based on the report provided by Dr. Lewin. So yes, the challenges are persistent. However, we must acknowledge that significant research has been produced through the mergers, and we continue to measure our research input, measure institutions across nationally, but also, of course, looking how we measure globally. And we are rather proud of the achievement of some of our institutions, in particular UJ, which was one of the emerged institutions. A full evaluation and assessment would require an agreed framework and a far more in-depth data analysis. Chair, we certainly would do with additional research around some of the factors that we have presented. We could not cover all of them, but I believe that the more insight we gain, the greater our policies. And invariably, policies that are based on evidence is what it matters. And we are proceeding with extensive data analysis. Many challenges faced in the system show continuity with policy concerns that date back to the immediate post-apartheid period. And I want to be positive to say, yes, some of the challenges persist, but 7 years on, certainly one can see new identities have been established. We have seen neutralization of some of the extreme policies that preceded the current administration. And we certainly are observing new institutional landscapes and a certainly mixed reporting, with some institutions needing far more help than others. And we are making a concerted effort to focus on the weaker institutions. And I think it's best I stop here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, DDG. DDG Sotikwa. Can I check DDG Mbalo, is there anything you'd like to say before we continue? Let's check if the DM is here.
Chairperson and honorable members of the committee, I should think at this point in time, I would say that we are at your service because it has been a journey, and I must also appreciate the fact that you have allowed us to go through and make it a point that we finish this presentation. Dealing with the successes and challenges of measures, as well as incorporations of our higher education institution. And then I should think you might have realized that transformation is a journey. There is a lot of work that has been done, but then obviously there is still a lot of work to be done, especially with regard to issues related to expanding our post-school education and training opportunities through our higher education. At this stage, Honorable Chair and honorable members, then we can just leave it with you now so that we engage in areas that you think are quite very critical to be engaged on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, DDG Mvalo. Colleagues, I still don't see the DM on the platform. But Mr. Pinga, was there any response from your side? Is he on the platform? No. Mr. Sonti?
Not on my side, Chair, but I'll just call Bayanda now and see.
All right, thank you so much. We did receive an apology from the DM saying that he would join the meeting but have to leave early. So that's why I keep checking if the DM is here. There might have been challenges because we were told that he needed to address the gender-based violence awareness program at SIET College in KZN. So colleagues, will move on to questions and inputs and recommendations from members. I must indicate that it really has been interesting and enlightening to receive this presentation. In fact, I wish we had received this presentation much earlier in our term, because it gives you such a great or a greater understanding and a historical context into the realities that our institutions find themselves in. I mean, Thandi keeps saying colleagues would remember in 2002. 2002, I was 9 years old, Dr. Lewin. So I definitely was not looking into mergers of universities and technicons. So yeah, I was in grade 3. So I definitely would not remember, but one can only imagine what a difficult period it must have been for the sector, because definitely, there are, there were a lot of trade-offs that had to be made, a lot of risks that had to be taken for a greater and, appreciation and understanding of the fact that we needed to have an equal higher education sector or system. I mean, we still till today argue about the inequities or inequalities within the system. I mean, post-COVID or during COVID, that was really a great concern to the sector. Now, I can only but imagine how it was then, before the mergers, these inequalities, this inability to share the resources fairly across the spectrum, and resources not only, financially, but even on infrastructure. I mean, till today, we still argue about sharing infrastructure when the minister emphasizes sharing of university infrastructure with the TVET program. It speaks just to that, to creating equality within the system. And so colleagues, for me, it's really been enlightening to listen to this, and I'm so glad that there was a shared responsibility in presenting, or in the presentation, because I think listening to how colleagues take the facts that are here, but narrate the information to give context to some of us who were only 9 years old at that time, has really assisted in taking this information that you had sent us and bringing, an understanding, a story to it, because really it is something very interesting. But I think the greater task that we have is how do you overcome some of the ongoing challenges that one has an understanding of where they come from, given this particular presentation. I mean, I think even with simple things like satellites, what you refer to as satellite campuses, I think even the fact that we refer to them as satellite campuses, because the main campus usually is the campus that would have had the greatest resource. I mean, when you look at UJ, for example, main campus is the one in Auckland Park, or that's the one that's referred to as main campus. And then you have, for example, Soweto campus, and the stereotypes that still exist with that, when a student applies and, they said that whatever qualification they have is offered at Soweto campus. There is a stereotype that comes with that. So how do we break those particular stereotypes as well? With the understanding that we have this one unitary institution now. I mean, University of the Free State, and we think of some of the challenges that arise from Gwagwa campus. So there are those particular challenges. I'm just mentioning a few that are very soft issues. I'll come back to some of my other questions at a later stage. But, though we are still trying to overcome inequities and inequalities within the higher education sector. So one really appreciates this particular information. Just really wish we could have received it much earlier in our term, but it really gives greater context to the realities of our sector. Colleagues, I'd like to now note hands of members. I hope these hands have gone up. We have Honorable Mananiso, Honorable Litsie, Honorable Sibia. Honorable Mananiso.
Thank you, Chairperson. Let me start by actually welcoming the presentation, and as well, one would want to reiterate what you said, to say, I wish as well we could have had this particular presentation before today. However, it is what it is, and one must say that at least there's a good story to tell with regards to the merger and incorporation of institutions, more especially with regards to what it's been presented on slide 45 and 46 with regards to a positive picture of research output. I think one must say that at least there's a sense that this was a fit for purpose process that the department could have done for these institutions and for South African educational system. Chair, my other comment as well is with regards to what Thandi have said when she was presenting slide 18 on issues of 10 meshed institutions. I think in future as well, we would need a presentation with regards to comparison of those meshed and not meshed institutions, so that we are able to check if this is what we will continue with, or we would need to review some of the decision that we could have made. So I think it is important that in future we must have that presentation that has two pictures of meshed and unmeshed. And Chair, my other input and comment to the department is with regards to the research. I know it is expensive to do research in terms of making findings, if whatever that you have taken as a decision, it is still, fit for purpose or what. So I just want to say to the department, perhaps in future, they must look on reasonable ways, more especially of finding out if the measures can be maintained or not. We need to perhaps go out and call for people who've actually used these particular institutions prior, meshed, and now, so that they tell us their stories. Perhaps those particular stories, they can give us sense in terms of what needs to be done in this particular institution. For instance, we've got issues of governance, administration, and management that I feel that in this particular presentation, they are not that elaborative, and we know for the fact that in some of these institutions there are issues that we know that they affect performance management, and they need to be attended sooner. So it is important that we get sense of how is the feeling from our constituencies in terms of the services that they are using in this particular institution. That's just a comment. But my question, Chairperson, is with regards to how many institutions were affected by poor governance and leadership pre the measures. That is one of my question for today. And the other issue is with regards to audit outcomes. You can see on the presentation that in some other institutions, you have where they have unqualified audit findings with no findings. And I feel that in those institutions, I mean, they just need to sustain that particular thing of having unqualified audits without findings. So I just want to emphasize to the department that they need to make sure that this institution, they stick to their program of action in terms of applying the recommendation by the Auditor General, so that there should be sustainability. I think in this particular portfolio committee, we normally speak more on issues of finance, to say if we've got people proper human capital, why do we find ourselves not having a unqualified audit without a finding? So it is important that the department strengthen their monitoring and evaluation with regards to issues of dealing with program of action by these institutions, because Chairperson, I don't think as the portfolio committee would want to always speak on issues of consequence management, this must be done and so on. So, but it is important that people in this institution, they just need to do what is right at that particular time. And we cannot compromise the issue of education in South Africa, as it is our apex. So it is important that everybody does what they have to do, so that as members of parliament, when we do our oversight is not interference, but intervention to things that we know that they can be done by those who are employed to execute their task. Thank you, Chairperson. That's it from myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Mananiso. Honorable Litie. Okay, I think I'm going to go to Honorable Sibia, then I'll come back to Honorable Litie.
Chair, I was not hearing you. In fact, I almost asked if it's my network, but I see now it's just saying my internet is unstable. I don't know why it does this. When presentations were done, it was very stable. And now that I'm supposed to pose questions, it says it's unstable. This is not the first time. I don't want to suggest that maybe it's sabotage or something, but I suspect the acting DG might be having something to do with this. That was on a lighter note. Good morning, honorable members. Good morning to the acting DG, all DDGs, our committee staff, members of the ministry. I also saw earlier on that the advisors to the minister were in the meeting. So good morning to everybody. Indeed, Chair, it's been a very long recess period. It's good to be back. Those who go to Honorable Yabo's church, when Honorable Yabo says it's good to be back, the congregation responds and says, Kumnandu Kubala, something to that effect. Chair, I want to appreciate the presentation from the department, which indeed was quite long, detailed, properly, which will, I have a few questions there. I think maybe let me start with the question that Honorable Mananiso asked on the institutions that were affected by poor governance and leadership. My question on that, Chair, is that on this institution pre-merger, how many were affected by this and by this poor governance and leadership, and can the department draw a conclusion based on the data available to them that this poor governance and leadership were due to merging, were through to that merger process? That will be the first question, Chair. Number two, Chair, we know that Sulu University, UKZN, and CPUT have high student debt ratios before impairment, whilst both UNISA, Northwest University, and UJ have a low debt ratio. Can this difference be attributed to the financial policies and enforcement in the management of fees and debt management, or it is based on the class composition of students in these various institutions, meaning is it, a class issue, this thing of the debt ratio. And then when Thandi was presenting, she was talking about the federal measure model and the unitary measure model. Now, in relation to that, from the institutions which were merged, in retrospect, based on the experience now, post the merger, which institutions have been successfully merged in a unitary measure or manner, and which institution have resulted in federal characteristics? I hope the question is clear. And then the demerger, we've had one so far, University of Limpopo and now Sfako Makhato. What were the key causal factors which contributed to the demerging of this institution? And these factors, can we see them in other merged universities currently now? Yeah, I think maybe let me leave that question at that. And then in terms of research output per capita, does the department have a measurement of output from an impact factor dimension to assess the qualitative aspect of research output than just the quantitative aspect? And then what are the causal factors that contribute to the output per capita in HDIs, and what interventions have been implemented to improve research output in our HDIs? And then in their conclusion and analysis, the department recognizes that challenges faced in the system show continuity with policy concerns. What policy interventions would be needed to address the shortfalls of realizing the 7 policy rationales of measures? And maybe, before last, with the promotion of staff equity, one of the policy rationale, and noting the imperative of equitable distribution of resources, how can academics be equitably distributed in the higher education landscape, and in such an intervention, and is such an intervention possible? And then maybe last, Chair, is the department of the view that in circumstances of measures which failed in critical performance areas, such institutions can be demerged and developed as standalone universities? And maybe we should, the department should undertake a comprehensive study on measures with proper, clear terms of reference, guided by the policy objectives or policy rationale of the measure processes, with an in-depth analysis of each institution. I think I would not, maybe let me go into the financial health comparison, Chair. I think their presentation covered that aspect very well. Maybe on audit, Maybe even let me leave the audit. Thank you very much, Chair. I think let me stop at this point. Thank you.
Honorable Sibia. Thank you, Honorable.
Oh, thanks. I thought I was sabotaged. Okay.
Thanks, Chairperson. Would like to welcome the report and morning to everyone. Between 1988 and 2003, VETS and UCT declined in research publication output. What are the identified causal factors of such a decline? The second one, what is the overall impact of the new generation of academics program, Natural Imaging Scholars Program, and the Future Professors Program against the demands for academics as university enrollment increase? I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Sibia. Honorable Yabo.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. I would like to request to keep my video off. I have been having challenges with my network reception, and even as I speak, a message keeps flashing on my screen that my network is unstable. I'm hoping that at least you can hear me. Let me welcome the presentation.
We can hear you, Honorable Yabo.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Let me appreciate the presentation that was made to this committee this morning. And let me, without further ado, shoot straight to my inputs and questions. I think in the presentation that has been made to us, UJ is a perfect example of what great leadership can produce in an institution of higher learning. The improvement that has been recorded in that institution, and as far as meeting the requirements matrix for sustainability, is nothing short of worth applause. And this is what all institutions must strive to achieve. Academic output is what should be the focus of all institutions of higher learning, because it is what matters at the end of the day. And so as you produce academics, they also should be able to produce works that are able to be peer-reviewed across the globe, putting our institutions as world-class, at the level of world-class with other, compared to other institutions of higher learning across the world. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from the UJ story. Now, the question that I would want to ask is, can we say that our institutions, on average, are on par with the best in the world? And what are some of the unintended consequences of these measures that have been observed by the department? But also, I have noticed that there are some institutions here that are worrisome due to their seeming inability to meet the requirements of future sustainability. TUT and WSU come to mind, especially where the question of surplus and the contribution they receive from the government is concerned. They are recording some of one of the highest percentages in those regards, and where surplus is concerned, some of the lowest percentages. WSU recording even negative growth in that space. What interventions are planned by the department to assist struggling institutions such as those? Now that the problem has been noted, what interventions are being put together to assist those institutions? Most of these institutions, Chair, have attained unqualified audit findings, audit outcomes with findings. Could we be told what are the most common of these findings? And it seems it's a common thing that these institutions will receive unqualified audits. I think we can appreciate the fact that many have moved from receiving qualified audits to now getting unqualified audits with findings. I think the with findings part is still worrisome, and perhaps the department can shed some light on what some of these common findings are. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Yabo. Honorable Mahlatsi.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to yourself and colleagues, the department, and everybody on the platform. As Honorable Yabo's request, I will also request to remain in the dark, if that is the right word to use, without necessarily putting my video on. Let me first and foremost really appreciate the presentation by the department. It's quite comprehensive, speaks to detail, but one would want to indicate upfront that the presentation mainly focuses on the academia, which is quite important, by the way. But it does not touch on the constituencies that constitute the entire PSET sector in as far as higher education is concerned, in as relating to the sector that we're dealing with. When I speak about the sector, I make reference to your labor, which constitute part of the community, to say how did the measure impact on the labor, making reference to promotion of staff to ensure that there's equity, inclusive of the fact that has the measure also improved, equity in as far as women are concerned, as well as people with disability, to a point whereby we would see women ranking a little bit higher, apologies, Lalo, through this particular measure, in ensuring that the equity that we always make reference to sees the light of day through this measure. Secondly, the measure, I think the intention also was to deal with academic programs where different universities do not necessarily have to compete for programs, but we can have an integrated approach. Has that been achieved? My last point, making reference to labor as well, where UNOS informed or did they participate in the process? If they have, what was their attitude towards this measure? The leadership of different institutions, what was their attitude towards this measure? And when you look at the measures that have taken place, Chair, most probably it focused mainly on HDIs, with of course UOFs as well as UJ being part. what has been the impact of this particular measure between your HDIs and your sustained, or, I don't know what the correct word, but universities that could continue on their own without this particular measure? Has it impacted negatively or positively? And if it's positively, what were the outputs? If negatively, what are the outputs? And what is the way forward in relation to these issues? Going back to the issues of labor, Chair, ordinarily when you bring two institutions which were operating autonomously, given the reality that institutions of higher learning are autonomous, they decide how much to charge for what program, how much to pay for what position in an institution, in as far as your academic staff. Had that particular measure dealt with that issue in as far as salaries are concerned as well? And has it been able to improve the quality of life in terms of institutional culture of different institutions? That's where I will stop, Slalom. But it will be important to really get that side. Maybe the department, when it presented, we focused on the work that they have done without necessarily bringing other stakeholders on board to check whether, not necessarily to verify the information by the department, but to make sure that everybody is on board and the outcomes that has been presented by the department is satisfactory to all role players. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mahlathi. Thank you very much, members. Those seem to be the only questions that we have. I think from my side, I'd like to understand, besides SMU, are there any institutions, and I know that, perhaps on this front, not having the political leadership of the department here, the Minister or DM here, could limit the input that colleagues will give. But are there any institutions where we felt that perhaps we should consider a demerger, and maybe this particular merger of these institutions was not ideal and is not working, particularly in terms of critical performance areas of those institutions. In terms of SMU still, what is, we note the concerns that colleagues are speaking to in terms of the sustainability of the institution, the various challenges that the institution is faced with, and what are the possibilities of the institution. I don't know, what would we do considering the challenges that colleagues are referring to? What would happen to the institution? Would we merge it back with another institution? What could become the solution to it, or leave it as it is and try and strengthen it in its current form? I think that's something that one is interested to hear. Also wanting to understand, colleagues, the capacity of, so you look at a WUSU, for example, where we appreciate the spatial location of the different campuses. I think a colleague said it could take 10 hours to get from one to the other. And you then think of some of the challenges that colleagues at the Northern Cape Rural TVET College speak about in terms of the vastness of the different campuses. But then you quickly think of TUT, where there's a campus in different parts of Pumalanga, I think also in Limpopo, if I'm not mistaken, and then in Gauteng, and colleagues will correct me if I'm missing out, if I'm leaving out any other provinces. But and also give us insight in whether we think that arrangement of having a TUT Mbombela campus is working, and whether or not, given those the vastness between those campuses, are we able to deliver on the core mandate of the institution? So, and if we are, can that not be mirrored to a reality of WUSU? Yeah, to strengthen it. Or is it working? So if the TUT arrangement is working, can that be mirrored as a way of learning and sharing information in order to strengthen whatever challenges may exist at WUSU in terms of taking into consideration the geographic location of the different campuses. And then in terms of, I'm not sure what Ms. Lewin was referring to in terms of the HE and I think I missed the first part. Of course, she indicated that universities are not audited by the AG, but there's a report of some sort that can be received from the AG, or I think I might have misheard you, but very interesting engagement with the AG SA about 2 weeks ago, and the conversation was about what portfolio committees, whether or not we appreciate the information that we receive from the AG and the role that the AG plays in terms of our work as portfolio committees, and what needs to be strengthened in terms of that. And I think, if there's a sentiment or a view that there is a greater role that the AG can play in assisting us as a in strengthening our institutions and the outcomes of their work, then it's clear that as a portfolio committee, we would be willing to be a motive force in advocating for increased support from the resource limitations and capacity that they have. But there is room for that engagement. I always say that our role as a portfolio committee is not to just go around with a red pen and give recommendations, but it also is to receive recommendations from yourselves as stakeholders to say, if we received more support in this regard, we would be able to do X, Y, and Z. And so I think one would like clarity on that particular matter, and for us to see what role we can play as a committee in advocating for greater support in that regard. And then in terms of the capacity building programs that were highlighted towards the end, for me, that really is so important, but the impact of it, so it's all good and well to be able to list a number of programs that have been put in place. But it would be great to understand if the department genuinely the impact of these particular programs and have an ongoing relationship with the institutions to say, given the challenges that your institution is faced with, perhaps in this regard. And so one would like to understand if there is that particular monitoring and evaluation of the impact goes towards
Sorry, Chair, we can't hear you at all.
Just to become excursions and, you know, I don't know, we need to really ensure that we have great, I think I'd want to rise at a later stage. Okay, I think I had network challenges. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Chair.
Okay. All right. I'm handing over to, I hope you heard my input on the capacity building programs, DHET Mvalo.
Indeed, we got it, Honorable Chairperson.
Okay, all right, that's fine, because that was my last input. So if you heard that, then we're fine. Over to you, DHET Mvalo.
Honorable Chairperson and honorable members, I must say that we are really quite very impressed here, especially with observations by the members of the Portfolio Committee with the work that we have done, and obviously also with some of the challenges in terms of gathering the data that was required of us for this particular occasion. And observations in the main, appreciating the work that we have done. And we've tried to be comprehensive as much as we could in our presentation. Hence, earlier on, I appreciated the fact that we were given sufficient time to go through all the matters that were required of us to go through in this, in the Portfolio Committee of today. And I must say that issues that are being raised are very much thematic, but almostly all of them are taking us back into our policy rationale for measures. So did we achieve what we sought to achieve when we started with these processes? Issues related to social justice, social and structural inequality, and fragmentation of apartheid legacy in higher education, and many other issues relating to equity, access, and so on. So our approach then in answering Honorable Chairperson and honorable members, we will go back the way we started, requiring then therefore that Dr. Lewin will start, and then it will be Mr. Tofi, and then it will be DDG Esotsikwa towards the end, if that will be in order with the honorable members of the committee.
Thanks, DHET Mvalo.
Chair, I think that means I must go first. Is that correct, DG, acting DG?
That's in order. That's in order, Tandy.
Okay. All right. No problem. Thanks. Thank you. You know, thank you so much for the questions. Some really, really great questions that make us think a lot, I think. And I think very helpful for us. You know, our DDG has been you know, talking to us about what work we might need to do going forward in analyzing the mergers. And I think this gives us a good sense of some of the areas where we might need to collect further information. So really important. I will, I'm sure that Faisal and Dr. Sotsikwa will add, and I'll talk to the areas that I know about and in terms of the questions that we received. So just in terms of the question that both Honorable Mananiso and Letsia asked, essentially about, you know, how many institutions were affected by poor governance before the mergers. I mean, essentially, because the Higher Education Act came into effect in 1997, if you look at that table, I can't remember which slide it is, you know, the first two interventions, I think, were 2000 and 2003, but very little intervention in the system, partly because the Act, you know, only came into effect in 1997. And so very little. And then, of course, a lot of that period was policy development, you know, from taking the white paper into the national plan. And, you know, the institutional landscape being so different then that in a sense, I don't think governance, I don't think the capacity for governance interventions existed, but it also wasn't the major focus at that time, when the focus was on how do we create a unitary single higher education system with a unitary funding regime, with enrollment plans, with this was the time when they were talking about 3-year rolling plans of institutions, and how do you get all the institutions kind of working together in one system. So that's kind of, I think, why you don't see as many interventions before, because there wasn't as much focus on that at the time. But I think the other question around, I can't answer all the research questions. Honorable Sabia, I don't have a specific answer for you around the declining research outputs between 98 and 2003 at WITS and UCT, but I'm sure that we can get an answer for you on that from my colleague, Mr. Mabizela. He's currently in consultations around the institutional types policy, which I'll also come to as well. And then the other thing that maybe the DDG will talk more about, but is around the whole issue of the UCDP funded programs, and that it's not just about listing them, but about impact. And I think that's a very important question, because we are talking about a fund that is now in its second phase. So we started in 2018, and now we're in the second phase of the UCDP. So there's quite a big focus on monitoring and evaluation and trying to get a sense of what impact those programs have. And there's a formal M&E program that Mandisa's section is working with. And I think that at the moment, it's very hard to necessarily attribute some of the shifts in the system to that. But if you look at the NGAP, for example, I mean, the NGAP, if you look at per institution, the number of academics, over the time, you see that over 700 academics are introduced to the system. That's really quite significant in a relatively small system, but it's obviously not enough. But what it has done is it's able to stimulate and other kinds of programs within institutions that kind of work together to really focus, to provide a really good policy focus on some of the needs in that area. So I think I can't say too much about the impact, but I think we are beginning to see impact when you look at the kinds of numbers, particularly through the NGAP. Just in terms of Honorable Letzier's question about the debt, I mean, that's a really incisive question around what is the reason for that. And I mean, I think the reason really is that, some institutions have got stricter debt management systems than others. And I think you can see that. So it's not necessarily that, some institutions would have a higher level of kind of missing middle students, for example, who would have struggled to pay student debt, but which is a big issue for some institutions. And those students who are not funded through NSFAS. But also you're seeing now that NSFAS student debt is decreasing, of course, because the students on the new scheme are now the predominant numbers of students in the system. But it really is about institutions over time having managed their student debt profiles very differently. In terms of, I also think, Chair, just a general point that I want to make. I mean, when we were developing this presentation, we did not give, we weren't able to collect data on everything. And I think this also talks to the point that Honorable Mahlatsi was making, that there's a number of issues that we need to look at in terms of data. And I think particularly, Honorable Mahlatsi, you're talking the data around staffing, which is really actually a very interesting area. Now, I think we would need to look at a lot more depth at that to see, what the kinds of effects have been. I mean, because what we do is we look at system data now. So you can see at a system level that the demographics have changed dramatically, but it's still an issue that requires policy attention. We have to look at the whole issue of, there was a trend late 90s, early 2000s towards outsourcing and insourcing. Those have changed the numbers in institutions as well. There's issues of permanent staff versus temporary staff. And those are data that we are able to collect and that the CHE also produces through its vital stats every year. So I think we would need to look in more detail at that. And that's partly, and I also think that there's a lot of interesting information in the literature around this, around what the issues were at the time of the mergers. But staffing was a big issue. The kind of merging of different staffing models and all of that. So the attitudes towards that, I think that there's some research that's been done, inside institutions on that. But I think that I wouldn't want to necessarily make any, observations on that or any generalized statements without having really looked at some of the data. So I think that's something that we could look at, and I think that helps us a lot to think about when we are looking at data, what should we be looking at? I think that there's a question that kind of a theme question that goes across a number of the inputs, including that of Honorable Yabo and Honorable Mahlatsi, which is, can you see the impact of the kind of historic issues around advantage and disadvantage? I think you can. And I would hazard a guess, and this is, well, I wouldn't say it's a guess, but I think from what we know of the system, you can see that the issue of whether campuses were HDI campuses or advantage campuses does have an impact. And Honorable Yabo, if I can say that, if you look at something like UJ and you're signaling, you're singling out UJ as a successful institution, of course, yes, one wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, it's been a very successful institution in many ways, but also UJ had, there was a row around Afrikaans University, which was one of the big merged institutions. And if you know about how institutions were funded, on the old formula before apartheid, you will know that institutions that were historically Afrikaans-speaking institutions did have relatively strong financial reserves, at the time of the changes. So I don't want to say too much about that, but one can certainly say that those things are there. And then the other thing is that it also touches on this idea of rankings, which is a very complex issue for us in the department because yes, we have some incredible institutions. Our system is very strong, and we have institutions that are playing very strongly in the international rankings and everything. But rankings are also, they have very unintended consequences as well. And certainly from the department's point of view, we're very wary of ranking our institutions. And it's important that we also develop our own systemic ways of looking at how quality is taking place in our system and not necessarily looking at international rankings as a measure for us. I mean, obviously we're proud of institutions that do well in specific spaces, but it's very important for us. And then, Chair, if I can, this links then into another theme that came through a lot of the questions, which is, and also a very important question, I think, set of questions around the sort of geographical location. So SMU and UL, certainly geographic issues were a major part of the demerger from what I know. And I have to sort of temper that by saying I wasn't really part of that process actively as a member of the department, but certainly the distance between Ga-Rankuwa and Limpopo is a big issue. But also, one of the ways we've been able to deal with that is to provide specific and specialized support to SMU as part of the demerger to ensure that it is able to be financially sustainable going forward. And I think that that's something we can really look at. The same issue around WUSU, I think you will know that WUSU has struggled, in terms of this, whether it's a federal issue or not, being able to rationalize its campuses and its offerings and its staffing and its management structures. And that's very much part of what they're looking at before. But Chair raised the issue of TUT, for example, with a number of campuses across the country. I think that this is an issue that is very important, and the national plan talks to this around how we need to look at the size and shape of the system, possibly again over the next 10 years or so. But I would say that if you hear what the minister's been saying and looking at this, it's not just about the university sector, it's about looking at the whole PSET sector as a whole, taking TVET colleges and community colleges into account, the possibilities that we now have through this new institutional types policy, which Chief is busy talking about at the moment. We probably need a comprehensive look at the system, but the whole system, the PSET system. If you include the agricultural and the nursing colleges, if you include the feasibility of 2 new universities, you look at the higher education landscape, you look at the full post-school landscape. This is something that the national plan talks to quite a lot, and I think would be something that we definitely need to pick up. And part of that could be then also, let's reflect on the mergers and let's reflect on what the current landscape looks like and whether, if you look at the whole PSET system, whether there aren't shifts that, you know, could take place in there. And Chair, I think I'll allow my DDG and Faisal to come in and answer some of the questions as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chair. I think Thandi has covered some of the questions in relation, especially in terms of WUSU, in terms of its internal rationalization of programs and its spread across the various campuses. And then also when you look, for example, at institutions like TUT in terms of the spread of campuses. But I think one of the key things I think that's coming out of this engagement with the portfolio committee, that we will have to look at some of these issues, especially taking a spatial perspective when we start looking in terms of the number of campuses and the spread of programs across these various campuses and the various offerings. But also just to take into account also that when we look in terms of the merger process that took place, it took place over a relatively short period of time. If you look, for example, 2003, we had 6 distinct categories divided in terms of racial lines. And then by 2005, we had 3 categories, which is basically our traditional, our comprehensive, and our University of Technology landscape. So some of these stuff is actually now filtering its way throughout that we need to address. And I think the guidance that we've received here will assist us in terms of taking some of these processes forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start off by referring to the caution that the CHE then, and that's in 2002, provided, I think it was to Parliament. A CHE said the following. It said, 1, you must ensure that there is sufficient capacity to manage the proposed mergers or incorporations. You must ensure there's sufficient resources to finance the mergers. And lastly, the implementation of the mergers should be phased in. Now, the then members of government did not agree that it should be phased in because they wanted to minimize the resistance, but also to speedily address the crisis then. So I just want to quickly take you to the crisis that they were facing, just to illustrate. The Cape Technicon had a shortfall of 80 million. The Technicon Northwest, 28 million. University of Venda, 8 million. University of Transkei, 202 million. University of Zululand, 70 million. University of Fort Hare, 115 million. And University of Western Cape, 192 million. So there was a serious crisis around how financial resources and how you were going to proceed with recapitalization of these institutions without addressing restructuring. And restructuring, I think, coherently presented by Mr. Tovi Faisal, around how you reduce the number of universities so that you then manage how you rescue them. So I just thought it's important that I emphasize that. And of course, the other part tied to it around the issue of capacity was the binary between technical universities and what you call universities. And what would be called comprehensive and what would not be called comprehensive. And how do you address that binary? Because we've seen the impact thereof over time. I think, Chairperson, you earlier mentioned the problem with satellite campuses and how they continue to carry this terrible stereotypes for learners who emerge from those institutions. So that you know, in some instances that binary has not disappeared, but in other instances, it has been resolved by articulation in some of the universities. And I think UJ has done well in this space. That is how it managed to, the articulation from vocational to academic and the reverse. And maybe that's the reason why they're doing so well. They've then also translated that into research output. what is the solution to the question of satellite campuses, and should we consider demerging? I just thought, Chair, you indicated then you were 9 years old, but the interesting part about the Eastern Cape phenomenon is that the merging came from the communities. If you look at the reports, the stakeholders who pushed for the merging of all 4 institutions, including UNITRA Medical School, came from the community in the Eastern Cape. And so, yes, we may have these disparities of geographic distances, but the call for that merger came from the community itself. And I thought that, when I look at the cabinet notes on this, they in fact considered that this community wants all these universities to be merged. I just thought I'd share that with you. And indeed, it may seem like a headache now, but then it was seen as a positive initiative by government. Then on the question of, I think there were several questions around. So if we consider what should be demerged or merged, remerged, what should be reconfigured? Chair, I would like to say that's a very difficult question to respond to without requisite facts or research. And I say so because if you look at the universities, and I'll call them, and I know maybe one of them you come from, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but let me go ahead. The universities in the center of Gauteng, that is UJ, Wits, etc., they are spread. But overall, if one looks at their performance, they've done well. From a research perspective, if one looks at just the basic indicators, the question of integration, that is vocational and academic, and vice versa. The ability also of the students to transition from one school to another is quite so. Why are they doing well, say, as opposed to, say, perhaps say TUT or WUSU? What is really causing I would call unhappiness, tension, impacting on, and I want to point to an earlier comment made by Honorable Makhatsi about institutional culture. And we must acknowledge, and we must be candid, that leadership is critical in forming and framing an institutional culture. And one wants to say, perhaps that's why UJ is managing its dispersed institutions better than most. What are the other factors that we should consider when we do this analysis? Certainly, Honorable Makhatsi, as you've indicated, leadership matters, institutional culture matters, relationships between staff and leadership matters. And it is unbelievable how this lesson repeats itself across the different institutions. The question around or commentary around financial health, I think I mentioned what the likes of University of Western Cape were confronted with in 2002, a shortfall of 192 million, and to then have an unqualified report now, I think is a huge milestone. I think I should just share another bit of research that I encountered, not in doing this report for you, but it is interesting what is happening in the Western Cape. The degree of cooperation amongst all institutions is in fact taken to an extremely high level. In the Western Cape, the institutions there have formed an institution at another layer which coordinates collaboration, which coordinates articulation, funding, and so forth. So the unitary university model evolving in the Western Cape, I think, is informing the success of the Western Cape. Of course, you still have CPUT struggling a great deal, but it's clear that it's incorporation into this institutional vehicle that is coordinating all kinds at multiple levels, including use of library material across all the universities. So perhaps what we should do, because you were speaking about what are the possible solutions, perhaps we should encourage this integration far more extensively amongst the universities across the country, that they share the library material, particularly electronic library material, so that you don't have this fragmentation of use of electronic journals, which is very expensive in the long run. If they could collaborate, then they could bargain better prices with the publishers, for example. So certainly at another level, collaboration is something we may need to intensify given its success in the Western Cape. Then on your comment around incorporating students' experience, one cannot challenge that statement, Honourable Mananiso. It would help us to have a view of the students, so that you have this multi-lens narration of what's happening at our institutions. Certainly, hearing about the experiences would improve this report greatly. Hearing the experiences of management in the institutions, I think would also be very instructive. And of course, right at the apex are the members of council. Hearing what they have to say would also be, I think, enlightening. So I think a multi-pronged approach would perhaps give us the most comprehensive view of some of the shenanigans, evolving in some of our institutions. A comment was made earlier on, the impact of the UCDB program. Certainly, Chair, it's perhaps early days. As I indicated earlier on, that it takes time to produce a professor, and when that professor then executes their work, you then have to measure how they perform. What we have started considering the department is an M&E capability to do just that on the 3 programs established by UCDB. So we hope we will, once we have that function, we will be able, and it is absolutely necessary that it be independent from Ms. Takwe's unit, which is teaching and learning. So, and that independence will enhance its ability to report. So we are certainly looking at that as that extensive. I would view as a qualitative analysis, hopefully in the next coming year. And what we are relying on at the moment is student experiences. That is, the postgrad students, their experiences. They often write to the department, and they report, in fact, to Dr. Lewin's department. I think that gives anecdotal indications of how well the interventions are proceeding. But I think it's important that I concede that it is work underway, and those reports are evolving. And we hope we can present something far more comprehensive in the next financial year. Then there was a question around should, I think it was, the question came from Honorable Litsie on what policy interventions are required. I think there are quite a few. And given the line of questions you've shared with us, I think it is quite apparent that the higher, I'm now run out of words, the 1997 Act needs to be reviewed. In fact, the entire Act needs to be reviewed if we were to proceed logically based on the kind of challenges we've experienced. And I must disclose that Minister and Minister's advisors have pointed to this requirement, and that we also obviously need to consider the question of the articulation far more extensively. And then I think we've covered all the questions, Chair. I hope we haven't left out anything. Certainly, yes, before I forget, the question of labor and how we accommodate labor in our analysis. I think that point is appreciated. Their views were not incorporated here, but I do know that they were a critical stakeholder when the merger propositions were presented. And then I think we've covered everything, Chair. I'm just trying to ensure. Yeah, I think I've covered everything. And a last point on, I think also to do with the geographic spread of the campuses. That it is very clear that the students outside the central component of institutions, or outside the central establishment of the institutions, are less than happy. In fact, at a recent student accommodation summit, quite a few of the students that I was with indicated that they would much rather prefer to live inside campuses, inside university precinct, rather than outside the precinct. And I think that point comes back to living in the center of the institutions. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Chair. I hope we've covered everything collectively.
Thank you very much, DDG Sotsikwa. Babu Mvalo, uzofuna ukuvala?
Yes, my honorable chairperson, I should think we tried the best to respond to all the areas that were raised, and also we take note some of the areas advising us in areas that we need to obviously to continue to improve. And I must say, if you look into majority of any system, if let's say it's a merger, demerging, it really takes a long time for the system to mature, also with the change management obviously in place. And especially now, as the country are faced with all these challenges, and now we are almost close to 2030, whereby we've set ourselves for our institutions, including our higher education institution, these ambitious targets. And I should think any any disruption at this point in time, whilst also trying to ensure that we are realizing what we should be realizing, expanding the access, improving the efficiency and the success, improving quality, improving responsiveness, because such focus areas are quite very critical to us. And then I'm quite very happy also the language of honorable members of the parliament. We seem to be having a nexus in terms of the drive, looking forward, the impact that we must be making with regard to what we are offering in our institutions, especially in this instance in our higher education institutions. And really, mergers and demerging, it's a process. It can take you some time. It might also maybe is still too early to really have that comprehensive evaluation and seeking to change the direction. Well, I'm not sure how many years it will take us, whereby we'll say everything now is in order. But then obviously we are guided by those transformational and developmental imperatives the members are raising, issues of class, issues of gender, issues of race, geography, which continues to impact in terms of what we are offering or providing as the post-school education and training institutions, because we must touch rural areas. I know most of our institutions are in urban areas, but there is a call that we must have impact in rural areas where poverty, unemployment, and inequality are highly pronounced. I should think from us, Chairperson and honorable members, who are quite very happy at this point in time, not unless maybe there are some other issues members of the honorable committee would wish to still raise with us. Thanks very much, honorable Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mbalo. Colleagues, today has really been an interesting session that one has truly appreciated in giving context to how we find our system at the point at which it's at. And I think really it's something that I don't know if we discuss it and lift well enough in the conversations that we have in appreciating where our institutions are coming from and how we can build on them. Because I think for me, it's always important to understand imvelaphi yomntu, so that when they act in a particular way, you are given reasoning and understanding as to why lo mntu acts ngale ndlela. So the same goes for the institution. Sorry, for the system that we have currently. I think, Dr. Lewin, you touched on this, and for me, it's so important for us to zoom into it. It's the conversation that I think, when I think of Enompendulo, who came into Parliament in 2019, she kept asking this question, and later on, she came to a realization that the department has what they call this Imbali precinct. And that is the broader question. We've made strides coming from the system that we had prior, then we had the mergers, or let me say pre-mergers to post-mergers. But there's even more work we can do. And you see here, we're talking about integration. We're talking about a differentiated whole system, right? Where the articulation from one program of the department to the other becomes more seamless. We had lots of discussions about this during the midterm review, where DM even defended the CET program and its existence and location and where it currently is. So this articulation we want to see between the CET program, the TVET program, the university program. And, some of it, colleagues, we can't even achieve outside of government as a whole. I mean, if we, for example, want to deal with the pressures around students wanting to be at what is casually called or simply referred to as main campus, then we have to also look into the infrastructure realities of the environment of where the satellite campuses find themselves within, right? So that needs conversation with municipality, that needs conversation with provincial government, because I continue to say this, we cannot build institutions of higher learning in isolation to the communities of which they find themselves within. So it's actually a bigger conversation that we need to have on how we better integrate all our institutions, right? So that this vision of having these precincts in different parts of our country, these education precincts in different parts of our country comes to life. And I think we have spaces where we can easily do this, like the Northern Cape, for example, where the vision of the current Vice Chancellor is that we must move Kimberley from a diamond town, or a mining town, sorry, to an education town, a hub. So easily in that space where you have the Northern Cape Urban TVET College, you have Soplagi University, you have a number of CT colleges. How do we strengthen this vision that we have for better integration within the PSET system? And I think that's the task that we have. And I also want to say, colleagues, that I believe in introspection and reflection. We must move, take a few steps forward, then look back and see, okay, does it still make sense? Then you move. Of course, we can't always go completely back, and doubt ourselves every 2 seconds on decisions we have made. But we must never fear the importance of introspection and reflection, because we end up driving something because we are convicted and we are certain that it works. It works. And sometimes we waste resources on pushing something that doesn't work, as opposed to, having a moment to introspect and reflect and say, actually, what else could we do whilst the time still allows? And we have examples of this, colleagues. We have NSFAS, where at some point there was a lot of conversation. Actually, there was a call from my generation, I think probably even before I got to this, to say we don't trust those who administrate NSFAS on our campuses. So NSFAS must be centralized. Then it was centralized. Then got to it's too far. We have no access to it. It must come back to us. You can't access it. But I think where we are right now, DDG Mbalo, is not to take the extremes or taking it back onto campus, but to say what could work to ensure that the trust or the lack thereof that existed when NSFAS was on campus is not perpetuated, but the inaccessibility that we're currently experiencing is also addressed. So what else could we bring into the conversation or to the fore? And there's been conversation around regional offices, right? So that's the kind of reflection and introspection that we would like the department to do, to say, okay, whilst maybe at a TUT, and I don't think my question was answered, to say, and maybe colleagues need time to reflect on some of these questions. If we're saying at WUSU, there seems to be a challenge around geographic location and spatial challenges, right? But at TUT, we have the same sort of vastness. Which one is working? And how do we use and mirror good lessons for the other one? So those are the kind of reflections we need the department to make, and amongst others, where we make reflections on council, we make councils of different institutions and which ones work, which ones are struggling. We make reflections on institutional culture, we make reflections on accommodation, we make reflections on the student experience, and again, not taking away that the information that we have right now, the data that we have right now is really useful. But all that we need to do is build on the categories of analyses that we would like to make, right? So this is ongoing work, colleagues, that is very important in guiding us as we move forward as a sector. I mean, I think after this particular presentation, even the inputs we will make as members we'll be more informed because we will have a greater understanding of, oh, okay, actually this could be the reason why this institution finds itself with the kind of challenges that it finds itself with. Important for some of us at DDG Sotrikwa, who were 9 years old at the time of which these mergers took place, you know. So the very same community that we asked to say, who called for them for these institutions to be merged, we go back to them and say, Mpagati, Nite, we must merge these institutions. Is it working for us? Has it been working for you? How do you feel? Have we gone back and interacted with those communities? One of the challenges that we are therefore then having coming out of, since we've had these mergers, as a community, what is your view? What is your view on the strengths that have come out of these mergers? Then we move forward. You see, so that's the kind of work that we need us to make, colleagues, as we're going forward, as we move forward. So I've mentioned the issue of broadening the scope of data that is required, and we understand the limitations that colleagues have, but we really want to appreciate the fact that we need to continue with that analysis. We will try and see how we have conversations with the DHET, how we can support some of the data that colleagues are asking in terms of strengthening the monitoring and evaluation and oversight role that the department plays on these institutions. But for now, colleagues, I think we can leave it at that and say that from time to time, I think it would be very important for us to tap into this historical context that has been given to us in guiding the work that we must continue to do in the sector. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that, colleagues, without leaving anything out. The labor analyses that the work was speaking to, something that we need to look into going forward. Because those are some of the issues that continue to persist, for example, in the case of WUSU. And of course, taking into consideration where we are already seeing the type of integration of having a coordinated higher education landscape or system. So where we see the expansion or I don't want to say duplication of the Imbali precinct. I think there's work that's being done in Limpopo as well. So how do we see that? DDG Sotrikwa refers to the Western Cape and how there's a sharing of resources in that space across institutions. So how do we strengthen that kind of work? Also considering, of course, some of the strains that we have on accommodation and so forth. How do we revisit and relook how the higher education is? What is higher education? And that even goes to the question, Dr. Lewin, around rankings, which is a political conversation on its own, to say, okay, so what does this ranking really mean? I've always had my own issues with the ranking system. So yes, colleagues, that's where we are right now. Thank you so much to yourself, DDG Mbalo, and to all colleagues that have accompanied you. So we saw that DDG Mbop was on the platform as well, DDG Gasa, DDG Fuchane also on the platform. And I think, DDG Fuchane really looking at this, I can't stress the fact that it also really highlights how sharing of resources and capabilities within the entire PSET system. So thank you thank you very much, colleagues from the department. We will now be moving into another segment of the committee meeting. You are more than welcome to leave us or remain if you feel free to, if you would like to do so. I don't think kukuinto si fishai, but thank you very much, DDG Mbalo.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson, honorable members. We would really wish to be recused.
Okay. Thank you, Tandi. It's good to see you. 15 minutes now of our last meeting as during the midterm review, when we received presentations from Parliament. You know, some of the things that we discussed was that we need to get through minutes more quickly. But I really would like colleagues to allow for us to adopt the minutes on Friday. I think the briefing that we'll receive is short enough to allow us to go through those minutes. So we'll go through the minutes on Friday if that's okay with colleagues. But we have received confirmation that on Friday, the Department of Science and Innovation will be briefing us on the district development model. So that's the presentation we will receive on Friday. And I think they will send the presentation as soon as possible. Colleagues will remember that they were not due for Friday, but due to due to the fact that I'm trying to figure out if it's inavailability or unavailability. But due to the fact that colleagues are not available, we've had to rework the program, and so we will have the Department of Science and Innovation joining us, also then take the minutes that we're supposed to adopt. This meeting has then come to an end. Welcome back to all of you. And I hope I'm within all the work that we had to do during the constituency period, I hope we've been able to rest as well and spend time with our families. And I really, to those who may have lost loved ones during this period, Duduini, but we really are grateful that all members are back and ready to work. Thank you so much, colleagues. This meeting has come to an end.
Thank you, Chair. Bye, colleagues.
Recording stopped.